After 1.5 hours.
Oh my goodness.
You didn't eat good?
I just want to shake your hand.
Yeah.
Can bring you a sandwich. You like the sandwich?
No, I mean, what are we going to eat? I thought
What do you go to the kitchen and get you a sandwich?
cookie or something. Come on, give us a cup of coffee. How about a cup of coffee?
Get you some. Now, folks, and on this one we'll be discussing part 2, which is the Quran the Word of God? And we'll have a presentation by Dr. Jamal Badawi first, and then by Dr. Woodbury, and then we'll start the discussion after that. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Can you please close the door so that we get no noise from outside?
Alhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Just as it happened with many other topics, of course, 10 minutes is not an awful lot of time for a major topic like this. So, of course, it's not possible to respond to many of the points that were raised about the Quran before, and I hope this will be coming through the discussion. So my purpose in this capsulized discussion starter, you might say, is to directly address the question, is the Quran the Word of God, and if so, how or why? In doing this, I think there are two related issues which I mentioned before, that I apply them with a great deal of impartiality. I hope I'm not applying double standards here. I can apply the same critical question to the Bible as well as to the Quran. So I'm applying them now to the Quran. And I'd say I'll begin with two, and then I'll conclude with one additional point, that at least there are two fundamental issues, which would be also comparative issues. The question of authority and authenticity. By authority means, is there evidence that this, sufficient, convincing evidence that this is the Word of God? It's not the word of some other humans or followers of the Prophet. To answer that question, we can examine both internal evidence and external evidence. As far as the internal evidence is concerned, we find that the Quran, and again, I'm not going to bore you with so many citations, I have the figures if you like. There are several verses in the Quran that affirms that the Quran has come from Allah. Secondly, there are many verses in the Quran that specifically and explicitly deny that it is from any source other than Allah. Thirdly, the style of the Quran, if you look at it generally speaking, you notice that actually it is not somebody's writing and says Muhammad went, Muhammad did that. It's nothing like that. It is actually God directly speaking to mankind, like verses, we created the heavens and earth and we created you and so on. So the style itself, in many cases even it addresses the Prophet himself and say, O Muhammad, which means that somebody else is telling the Prophet what to say. Which remind me with Deuteronomy, God will put the word in his mouth. He's not speaking on his own. As far as the external evidence, some people would say, look, internal evidence may not be enough because somebody could concoct a book or a document and just make it look as if it's coming from God. So we have to look at the external evidence as well. When we look at the external evidence, there are a number of points that strikes us as Muslims. One is that that claim is not only in the Quran, but it was also made by the one through whom the Quran was revealed, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And as indicated earlier, his reputation, even among his enemies, it was that of a man of a great deal of integrity and truthfulness. Even in the night when he was supposed to be assassinated by the pagans, he let Ali to sleep in his bed to return the deposits to the people who wanted to kill him. They used to belie him as a prophet, yet they keep their deposits with him. So that shows that there was some other prejudice that's preventing them from following him, yet on a personal level they fully trusted him. Secondly, as indicated earlier, and I'd be willing to discuss any objection to this, there's absolutely no credible evidence to show that, yes, he was truthful but epileptic or have some psychological phenomena or psychic element or hallucination. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. Three, that the Quran surprisingly contains some chastisement of the Prophet for a small mistake of interpretation, as was mentioned earlier. Nobody writes a book chastising himself for a small mistake that nobody even noted, because nobody noted even that the Prophet was getting frowned a little bit because of the interruption of that blind man. That shows the truthfulness of communicating exactly what was revealed to him. Sixthly, the Prophet, peace be upon him, as one of my colleagues also mentioned earlier, has gone through periods of great pain. False accusation made against his wife, people challenging him with questions. Yet, if he were to concoct something, he did not just appear as someone who knows all and answer. He would wait until the revelation comes, sometimes at great deal of mocking on the part of his enemies. Seventh, that the Quran contains, the Quran and the saying of the Prophet through whom the Quran was revealed, both contain numerous prophecies, many of which have already come to pass during the lifetime of the Prophet or shortly after. Not a single one whatsoever was proven to be false, and some of which could have been very, very unlikely, given the circumstances and context in which they were made. Number 8, the Quran itself makes a challenge. One of my brothers mentioned that earlier, that if the Quran was from any source other than Allah, they would have found therein many contradictions. I mean, I haven't seen any credible, they have been alleged contradictions. I have never seen any credible thing that you could say this is a contradiction of fact, something that could not be explained reasonably without going into great lengths explaining it out. Number 9, that the Quran challenged his contemporaries, and the Arabs were excellent in their expression that the Prophet was never a poet or a speech maker, that when they claimed that this Quran comes from human source, it was challenging them in a very provocative way to produce something like the Quran. They failed. Then said 10 chapters like the Quran, they failed. Then 1 chapter, even then they failed. So even the smallest part of the Quran, anyone who tried to imitate the Quran made himself a laughing stock of his people. And that was the witness and testimony of people who excelled historically. That's the epic of eloquency. That must say something about the nature of the Quran, and that has never been met, to my knowledge, for the 1400 years since its revelation. But that's not all, because you could have beautiful thing that is not necessarily true or not revelation. But one of the most amazing thing that one of the sisters raised in her questions, which could not be brushed aside, even though it is not the main mission of the Quran, is that unlike any previous scriptures, quite frankly, there is no single verse in the Quran that you could say it comes into conflict with an established scientific fact. I refer you to a book by Maurice Bucaille, The Bible, the Quran, and Science, where he made a study for both scriptures. But more amazingly even is the testimony given by Christian scientists. I'm not saying about a church group, the scientists of Christian faith, specialists in their area, like Dr. Keith Moore, an internationally known authority on anatomy and embryology. When the Quran speaks in amazing accuracy about the early embryonic stages that were discovered only after the discovery of the electronic microscope, something that was definitely, he was challenged once in a lecture, could this have been known before? He said, no, there's no way. From the history of science we know, there's no way. And the same thing applies to geology, astronomy, and many other areas that are so amazing, many of which are mentioned in Bucaille's book, that definitely the Prophet could have not known it, because not only religious people, but even scientists could not understand this, that the Quran describes in great accuracy. In addition to this, we find that the question of authenticity also was alluded to earlier about the Osman copies. I'll be glad to address that. I mean, there's not enough time in the remaining few minutes to address it. But I could only put it in a nutshell by saying that, uniquely speaking, the Quran was preserved simultaneously via 2 means at the same time. Memorization, which is even the more important, as well as writing in full. There have been no Qur'ans, no versions of the Quran. Versions, there have been qira'at, and I'll address that. Some people mix qira'at with versions. There's nothing like versions as such of the Quran. And there is even documentary evidence until today that shows that the Quran really that we have today is the same as was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, if you take the combined evidence by preservation in memorization and writing all together. But to conclude, it is not the issue simply of saying that there is evidence of authority of the Quran. It is from Allah, which in itself is sufficient. It is not simply to say that it is not only from Allah, but has been preserved intact without adulteration, nor to say that it challenged people from the scientific standpoint or the literal standpoint, which even means a lot because it points out to something about its source. But I think what is more important also for the average Muslim is the fact that the Quran provided what is best for the guidance of humanity in our understanding. On the issue of belief in God, it restored the true monotheistic faith of all of the prophets prior to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It discussed in no unclear terms that the aberration that has taken place in history, correcting them. It corrected the vision of the prophets and restored them to the proper status without deifying them on one hand or downgrading them and accusing them of terrible sins on the other. It provided a better, in our humble understanding, explanation of the question of salvation. Removed the notion of original sin and blood sacrifice and given hope to millions of people to reach for God and seek His help in overcoming sin. It provided a vivid description and explanation of the life hereafter, punishment and reward, individual responsibility, and the hope in the mercy and compassion of God. It gave a proper structure for worship that stand in the middle between the extreme of formalism and ritualism practiced by Jews at the time of Jesus, and between simply talking about love without really giving some structure and organization in the life of the individual, making a daily diet, spiritual diet, devotional prayer 5 times every day. It takes a few minutes, but it's tremendous. It has tremendous impact in the life of people. It provided comprehensive guidance, practical guidance in the lives of people, not only in the case of love and peace, but how to behave in war, how to behave in peace with friends, with enemies, with people living in peace who are not Muslims. And that is more practical if it were to be a total guidance for all mankind at all times. Finally, the fruits of that has been amazing. Just like my Christian brethren has been talking about the impact on the disciples encountering Jesus. The same claim has been made throughout history. People who have been most evil responding to the Quran, they were totally changed. Umar, a person who was going to kill the Prophet, on his way to kill the Prophet, hearing the Quran, his whole heart has been transformed and became one of the most pious people in history. In contemporary history, we find the same. People in prison, and I happen to know more closely about that because I have been in touch with the Islamic Teaching Center. There are hundreds and thousands of people, actually, who are in prison on very serious crimes and problems. They have been totally changed when they read the Quran. There have been people like Yusuf Islam, or formerly Cat Stevens, who report, many, Cat Stevens is only one of them, who reported that just by reading the Quran, they said it's different from any book we read before, religious or non-religious. I feel that God is speaking to me. So that testimony also, even though it cannot be taken alone because personal experience could be quite subjective, but in line with all of the other evidence that has been given, if we consider the millions and millions of people throughout history, in all countries, in all cultures, whose life have been totally transformed by the Quran, to me as a Muslim, that is much more than sufficient reason to say, yes, it is the Word of God.
Thank you, Dr. Jamal. Dr. Woodbury?
Once again, I have to say that I speak with considerable hesitation because it is not my pattern to say things about Muhammad or the Quran negatively, but and I see a great deal that I feel very positive about too, but this is an assigned topic, and so I think I need to explain why I do not accept the Quran as the Word of God, even though I do see the Word in Christ and as it is testified in Scripture. Let me just say that I studied Arabic in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, under a Muslim professor who would give us the rules of grammar and then would on occasion say, the Quran is different here. I also studied under Daoud Rahbar, who was a Muslim when I studied under him. But he had given a paper where he encouraged Muslims to be like Christians in really looking at the textual evidence for the Quran and analyzing it to construct as faithful a text as possible. And he was told to recant, and his paper was not included in the proceedings of the conference, and that was one of the things that ultimately led him to become a Christian, was because he felt he could not really study the Quran as a Muslim and really look for analyze the textual sources and so forth. But let me say, first of all, on internal evidence, why I have questions about the Quran. First of all, Baladuri, page 473, mentions, again, a Muslim author mentions about a secretary's exclamation that gets added to Surah 23, an exclamation by Uthman's foster brother, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh. Furthermore,
what excellence, can you just indicate what it is, just to get clear information on it?
Okay,
what is it?
I'll have to check my source here a little later, and I'll be happy to do that. Then I find what appear to me as a reader of the Bible to be confusions in the Quran, and it is always up to the second scripture. The burden of proof always rides with the second scripture to prove that it has not made a mistake, it seems to me. But Haman, for example, is put in the court of Pharaoh rather than in the court of Ahasuerus in Surah 40, verse 36 or 38, depending on your translation. Pharaoh said, Haman built for men a tower. Then certainly the obvious evidence, it would seem, for Surah 19, verse 28 or 29, is that when Mary, or Miriam in Arabic, is referred to as a sister of Aaron, that this would seem to be in a confusion, certainly on the surface there, rather than the mother of Jesus. It seems to be a confusion of two entirely different periods. And then talking about scientific evidence, in Surah 12, verse 49, the fertility of Egypt is described as resulting from rain rather than the inundation of the Nile.
Where is that?
Surah 12:49, if I've written it down correctly. And then there are certain passages in the Quran which it seems to me that an unbiased reader would see are taken from Jewish folklore rather than being in the scriptures that the Quran says it affirms. For example, the story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5, verses 27 through 32. Verse 31, then God sent a raven scratching up the ground to show him how to hide his brother's naked corpse. Well, this is found in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, chapter 21, not in the scriptures of the Bible. Then in Surah 5, verse 32, for that cause we decreed for the children of Israel that whoever killeth a human being for other than manslaughter or corruption in the earth, it shall be as if he killed all mankind, and whosoever saveth the life of one, it shall be as if he saved the life of all mankind. And again, this seems to be taken largely from the Mishnah of the Sanhedrin 4:5 rather than scripture. Furthermore, I would say anybody coming from the outside and looking at the story of Abraham in Surah 21, verses 52 through 70, being saved from a fiery furnace, would see that it is from the Jewish scribe Jonathan ben Uzziel, who mistook Ur for Ur and thought Ur of the Chaldees that Abraham came from for Ur or a fire. Then a second reason I have some problems is because of the report that the texts are that the texts are exactly the way we have them from the time of Muhammad, and this seems to ignore historical records, Muslim historical records. First of all, in Suyuti, in Itqan, Volume 1, page 21, he indicates that there is no collected, arranged, and collated body of revelations at the death of Muhammad. Then when we read Ibn Abi Dawood in the Kitab Masahif, page 83, it indicates that many of the companions of the Prophet of God had their own reading of the Quran, but they died and their readings disappeared soon afterwards. Then again, as we read Ibn Abi Dawood in Kitab al-Masahif, page 23, portions were lost when some reciters died at the Battle of El-Yamama, and the text was only collated after Muhammad's death by a number of companions. Again, they would seem to be essentially consistent, but a large number of variant readings. No two texts are identical at that time. And this is not just reciting different dialects without the vowel points there. And so you have 19 years after the death of Muhammad, the third caliph, that is Uthman, attempting a standardized text. Now, he took the Codex of Zayd, which was closed and was kept in relative seclusion with Hafsa, but it was not well known at that time. But you had the codices of Abdullah ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b with considerable variance. Furthermore, after Uthman's death, al-Hallaj, the governor of Kufa, made 11 amendments and corrections. I have had...
Who was the last person you mentioned?
Al-Hallaj, governor of Kufa, made 11 amendments and corrections. Now, one of my students once just compared, and here is a volume by Arthur Jeffrey, Materials for a History of the Text of the Quran. This is a book just on the variants now, I mean in Arabic. We're not, somebody said yesterday, produce another Quran. Well, this is at least producing the variants. And it is interesting that one of my students on his own compared 3 ancient manuscripts and came up with he compared a number of Christian manuscripts of the New Testament and some of the Muslim manuscripts. He compared the Sinaiticus Codex, an ancient one of the New Testament and a large part of the Old Testament, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus, and the Ephraimi rescript. He compared them in the New Testament for the number of verses omitted, the number added, and the number of texts affected. He compared the Codex Ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b with the text the way we have it today, and he found out that as for the number of verses in the New Testament as compared to the number of verses in the Quran, that the textual problem was even a slightly greater one for the Quran than it was for the New Testament, and I have the details of that here. Now, this is amazing, particularly when Uthman burned the manuscripts that tried to get them all burned, the ones that differed. So it is amazing to me that although Muslims have tried to get rid of the variants, there are still records of variants that are even slightly greater in the verses affected than you have for the New Testament manuscripts. And I could give a number of illustrations of how this has been suppressed. For example, in 1947, a student at the Egyptian University of Cairo wrote a thesis on textual criticism. And he never was given his degree. He was threatened with disciplinary action, and his advisor was dismissed from the university.
What is his name?
I do not have his name, but he is recorded. You can find the record of it in Arthur Jeffrey, who was there.
Is Arthur Jeffrey a Christian reference or a Muslim reference?
It is a Christian reference, but it is, you've got the,
Thank you.
you've got the record right here,
Okay,
so
thank you.
that I wouldn't make too much of a point of it. I think I have used my time here just to show that basically in the internal evidence and the textual evidence, I am not saying that the Quran is inaccurate. I'm just saying that their textual problems are as great as the Christian textual problems. And certainly the inconsistencies to me within the text are harder for me to accept than what you point out in the Bible.
Okay. Well, first of all, several remarks has been made about Rahbar who did not get his paper published, or the student, even if that's the story, suppose even the story is true, who could not get his degree. This has nothing to do really with the great effort of textual criticism that has already been done by the predecessor, and you did refer yourself to Jalaluddin al-Suyuti and others. In fact, that Jeffrey's book is based itself on a book written by Muslim, Abu Dawood al-Sijistani, the book of Kuttab al-Masahif. And that's why Dr. Draz criticized this contradiction sometimes is found in some non-Muslim writers about the Quran, when they said on one hand they say that the textual criticism of the Quran is in its infancy, yet in the very same books they write, you look at only the bibliography of the hundreds and hundreds of Muslim references about the sciences of the Quran and preservation, which seem to indicate a great deal of not a very straight scholarship in that sense. That's one thing. The other thing, when you talk about the internal evidence, I cannot respond to that because you haven't given me what exclamation or what exactly you're referring to in Surah 23. So until you get that, I'll reserve the answer to that. Thirdly, you said that it caused confusion to the Christian writer because it confuses Haman with Pharaoh or this. I think this is the same argument that one sister commented on before, that this is a very unfair thing to relate to the Quran because it has the presumption that the record in the Bible is absolutely accurate 100%, so anything in the Quran that is different from the Bible is not to be taken as accurate, not the other way around, which is a distinct, in fact, to the Muslim, it is a real thing, that the error is the other way around. Secondly, you refer to one instance when you say there is confusion between the sister of Aaron. This is one a very interesting question that you raised because since you said you know Arabic, you know that the expression in the Arabic language and in the Quran itself, when it says brother of or sister of, does not mean the blood brother. Just like the Bible, when it calls the Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, the daughter of Aaron, not the immediate daughter, but it means in the family. And Mary, mentioned in the Quran, of course, as coming from a priestly family. You are a sister of Aaron, not Aaron of Moses, the brother of Moses, sister of Aaron, like you see in Akh al-Arab, or brother of Arabs, not necessarily referring to one particular, the children of Israel, not necessarily the immediate children. So this is really not a problem at all. Then there was a question that you say that in Surah 12, Ayah 49, it says that the source of fertility was the rain, not the Nile. The verses are here. It has nothing to do with that, what you're talking about. It speaks about Prophet Joseph, alayhi salam. It has nothing to do with what you said. It says Joseph, when there was fear of shortage of food, or when the king saw that dream, he said, plant for 7 years, and whatever you don't eat, keep it. And then there will be 7 years where it's very difficult, and then there will be a year where there will be a great deal of shortage of food. It has nothing to do with fertility. But even if it were, which is not. Yeah, never mentioned the Nile or anything. But even if it were, what's the problem of fertility being both based on the rain as well as the Nile? But in any case, that is not the case. The quotation doesn't say what you're talking about. And then you have a number of points that you raised, that you somehow insinuated that the Quran must be based on previous scriptures, or on for example, the apocryphal writings or Jewish.
Folklore.
Yeah, I have two responses to that. One, I have no problem whatsoever if there is anything in the Quran that has parallel in the Bible, because the one who revealed the Bible in its original form is God. The one who revealed the Quran is God. And the Quran, but I must say with due respect, Dr. Woodbury, that you have a habit of quoting half verses of the Quran. In the previous session, you were saying the Quran says it came to confirm the scriptures before it, but you forgot to read the other part, وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ, a criterion, a guardian over it, which means you don't accept everything except that which meet the criterion of the Quran. So I have no problem with this so-called parallel so long as it's consistent with the Quran, because the revelation comes from the same source, not because one copies from the other. As far as the other apocryphal, some people even say the gospel of infancy and this and that, my answer to that is very simple. It has been admitted earlier, and it is quite clear that the choice of books to be included as canonized versus apocryphal was a decision made by human beings sitting down. And imagine human beings sitting in a council to decide what is God's revelation and what is not. This is not a matter for voting. So we don't know whether these things classified as apocryphal were not in its original form, really, at least containing part of the truth, whether it relates to Abraham or other points that you raised. Now coming to the question of preservation. You referred to Jalaluddin al-Suyuti's Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran. And I think, again, there is the confusion that I see in many Western writings about the Quran. In some cases, it may be innocent. In some cases, it is deliberate. When they make a big mix between recording or writing the Quran in full on one hand, and between compiling the Quran, i.e. bringing all the manuscripts under one roof. All the authentic sources, including the most authentic hadith in Bukhari, in Muslim, and others, there is no doubt about it historically, clearly indicate that whenever any verse or portion of the Quran was revealed, the Prophet, peace be upon him, had more than one scribe of revelation, and some historians give as many as 70 scribes of revelation. Some people were writing simultaneously, in addition to multitudes memorizing the verses of the Quran as they heard it from the Prophet. It mentioned also in the same sources that by the time the Prophet died, the entire Quran was committed to writing. Yes, it was not under the same roof, but it was brought under one roof. Not 19 years after the Prophet, but during the Caliphate of Abu Bakr. And it is well known historically that the Caliphate of Abu Bakr is only 2 years. Only 2 years, which included the Battle of Yamama that you were referring to. Secondly, when you refer to Abi Dawood, the Kuttab al-Masahif, I think again the mix-up here arises with respect to versions versus qira'at. And if you care to check the more authentic sources than these books even, the hadith, the authentic hadith that has been subjected to the most scrutinous accuracy, standard of accuracy, you will discover that what happened there is that the Prophet ﷺ himself said, نزل القرآن على 7 أحرف. The Quran was revealed on 7 harf. The word harf doesn't have a very clear English translation. I'll give you an explanation what it means, and then you can use whatever word. It is not exactly qira'at, that's mix up that some people have sometimes. But ahruf actually refers to the fact that because many tribes at the time of the Prophet were not used to certain words, that it's not in their tribe, the Prophet gave the concession to them, not on his own, under the guidance of Gabriel, to allow them to use a variant word to express exactly the same thing. An example that has been given of that, وَتَكُونُ الْجِبَالُ كَالْعِهْنِ الْمَنْفُوشِ. Ihn and Suf both mean wool, but the Prophet gave the concession to those tribes. Now, does that mean that there were 7 versions of the Quran or 7 Qurans? Absolutely not. And I challenge anyone to produce really something that gives a different kind of theology or different kind of message of the Quran, different except for these alternative, very minor variations. Yet, You must remember also that according to the most authentic sources in Hadith, that these were not the official copy. These were concessions made specifically to those people because people grew up in that tongue, and to insist on this particular word or that might have been very difficult and demanding for them. Yet, the official copy that was written under the supervision of the Prophet himself remained in the tongue of Quraysh, which we have until today. The memorization of the Quran did allow for this variations. So some people had this different qira'at, no question about that. It is quite true also that some people wrote for themselves on this qira'at. What happened in the time of Uthman was not a way of suppressing other qira'at. But I give you a very simple example. Suppose you don't know a word of French. Now, if you have been living in Quebec, for example, you might learn Quebecan French. If you go to France, you learn classical French. If you're a new young person, after Islam started to spread, it doesn't make a difference to you which one. So it's better to learn classical French. Now, for many of those who embraced Islam in a variety of countries, there was no problem there for them to learn the classical Qurayshite tongue in which the official copy of the Quran was written. And Uthman has a good reason to do that, because some people reported to him that even though these variations are very minor, doesn't change the meaning an iota, yet he said that some people started to conflict with each other's. My recitation is better than yours. So they suggested to him. Uthman did not suppress. And if you read history and the hadith also that speaks about this, what happened, that Uthman actually consulted with the companions of the Prophet. And let us remember that there were multitudes of them who were eyewitnesses who still memorized the Quran directly from the mouth of the Prophet. All of them believed that the Quran is the exact word of God. They would sacrifice their life for it if anyone is trying to suppress any portion of it.
Jamal, you're running
and
out
all
of time,
them,
please.
okay, I'll leave the other points. All of them unanimously agreed with Uthman. Even Ali himself, that some people say he had a different mushaf, himself praised what Uthman did to unify people. Yet there is evidence that not everything even was burned down on this other variation that was temporary. Not everything, and the evidence is that in Sijistani, Kutab al-Masahif and others, he still reports some of these. It is not different Quran, and if you open it and you look at it, you find that some of which, as Dr. Draz have given a very scholarly article on that, are of very minor nature, even though they were not official copies of the Quran. Other points I'd reserve for other time.
Thank you. You like to, one of you, please?
Either way,
Well, I want to deal with some of the larger issues myself, and I would maybe be a little bit more.
Okay, which one? Go ahead.
I wanted to deal with some of the larger issues. My interest, of course, is finding out, is there a revelation from God? Is there something I am missing? Is it possible that God has given something? And as I said before, if God has given a prophet, I can't lose by following that prophet or that revelation or whatever. And so I have an interest in finding out what is true. Now, I don't know whether that will mean that I will sincerely understand it all, but there are a couple of things that I encountered as I read the scriptures. And first of all, the thing that constituted a problem for me was the teaching that about the Quran itself. We have something that was a puzzle for me. And even though I came, or I was in a context where there were Christians who had a concept of revelation, still this teaching about Islam, and this is Al-Nasafi's creed, and he speaks here, God Most High speaks with...
Excuse me, whose creed?
Al-Nasafi's creed on God. Nasafi, okay. God Most High speaks with his word, commanding and prohibiting and narrating, and the Quran is the uncreated word of God, repeated by our tongues, heard by our ears, written in our copies, memorized in our hearts, yet not simply a transient state in these. And it goes on other things, talking about creation and other things. And I was trying to figure out how I could believe that there basically were two uncreated entities in the universe. Ultimately, you do have a picture that there is the God himself, and then there is this uncreated book. Well, in addition to that, maybe there is some link between the two. But ultimately, God must be different from his book. God is not a book. You do not worship the book. There is a difference between the two. So I have inevitably some kind of a dualism in God. And this is a problem for me. Another problem that I faced was the fact that the Quran is eternal.
So just a second, please. Do you understand the problem?
I feel that the point is totally out of line, really,
Well,
because he's quoting not from the Quran. You're not talking about the Quran. You're talking about people's opinion.
Do you understand the problem that he mentioned?
It's not a problem at all, but I understand.
Well,
my
you
problem.
understand what he
Can I
said?
finish? My problem.
Okay, that's fine. That's what I'm
Here, I'm
concerned
coming
about.
to this, and I want to know if this is the word. You don't have this problem. I'm talking about what, as I read and perceive the teaching of Islam on the Quran, as I read the book. The second thing was that it's eternal. Somehow or other, this book is eternal, and yet it's dealing with incidents that are locked in time. They're the particulars of history. And how you get that which is eternal and infinite and link that up with the finite, that constitutes a problem I think, for Islam. But it's particularly when you have a doctrine of abrogation. This was another issue. It was hard for me to understand if this book was eternal, and if it indeed was uncreated, then how could you have God, as it were, taking away a verse and then giving a better one? It seemed to suggest in any open or honest reading of the Quran that God is improving. God is doing better. And that was a problem to me. There are other issues we could speak to on the matter of scientific things. I didn't know at that time Bukhail's book or other things like that, and maybe I'll leave that for another point. But as I read the book, then apart from these issues, which were a problem in the back of my mind, I thought, well, maybe I don't understand this correctly. Is there some way I can get at the truth of it? And as I read the book, it was very difficult to understand. I would read it. It didn't seem to have a beginning or an ending. It was not clear. I frankly found many of the passages a muddle, passages that only could be understood if you already had perhaps the Old Testament or the New Testament. Then they might make sense. But for most people who come to read the Quran, it's very difficult to make heads or tails out of most of it. There are passages which are very good and very beautiful, but other passages which are a complete muddle. So it does reflect on the idea that this is the perfect and the ideal book. And so coming at this, my conclusion was, there were other things I could say too, but I'll cut it short, that I found it difficult to believe that this was a unique revelation from God.
What would be our
Thank
equal
you.
time? Because we want to share that. Some
Yes.
brothers want to have comments. on
Well,
this.
just go ahead. You have 5 minutes to reply.
Dr. Chaston, you have a problem of knowing what the Word of God is. Is it created or uncreated, right?
Well, he says it's uncreated. This is traditional Muslim theology, you know.
Yes.
It is uncreated, right?
Right.
Okay.
What's your problem with that?
Well, I said you have two uncreated entities in the universe. There's God and His Word. There's a book, and there are two things. And so you have a dualism that is eternal. And to me, this constitutes an intellectual problem.
Okay, in brief, the Word of God is what God revealed to the Prophet, and the Prophet received it through Angel Jibreel, and it has been compiled in the book from cover to cover that's known as the Quran. This Word is eternal. It has been with God since ever, because God does not come up with things after a while. He has anything that He wants to do tomorrow. To Him there is no time, there is no place, there is no space. And being eternal, being the Word of God, does not contradict being uncreated. On the contrary, if it is created, it cannot be eternal.
Well, you didn't get my point.
Okay, let me
respond.
have a chance to respond to.
You see, if you want to make a point, jump in. That's the way it is.
Now that's
We're
unfair.
giving equal time.
I'm just
Equal
kidding.
time.
Use it the way we want.
Yeah.
That's the way everybody
Obviously,
does it.
Obviously, Reverend Chastain could not find anything wrong with the text of the Quran, so he is criticizing the commentary of a writer about the Quran or an interpreter. The man is entitled to his opinion, number one. Number two, the Quran is eternal, created or uncreated. This is a theological argument that happened at one stage in the history of Islam. Again, I emphasize it is not an article of faith. It is not mentioned as an article of faith. Muslim theologians might argue points, but that does not mean that we have to criticize the Quran for argument among theologians. It's extremely unfair to criticize the Quran in the light of the history of the Bible for the following reasons. The Quran had been always in the hands of the people. From day one, people were encouraged to memorize it, people were encouraged to keep it. This is not the history of the Bible. For 1,000 years, Christians were killed for having a copy of the Bible. That is a historical fact. The Quran is in a living language. More than 200 million people speak Arabic fluently. The Bible is in the original Hebrew and the original Aramaic are dead languages. Maybe a handful of scholars can speak them today. Now, the Quran, Muslims had fought, had argued, had political differences, but I have never heard of the Quran being the subject of a conflict or different groups of the Muslims that had fought among each other because they agreed or disagreed about the contents of the Quran. Now, we keep ignoring the fact that the Quran is the only revelation that is still available in our hands today in the original language and precisely as it was taught by the Prophet. The same cannot be said about the teachings of Moses in his original language or precisely as was taught by Moses or the revelation that was given to Jesus and was taught by Jesus. Now, I want to read one single thing about one of the most critical people even of Islam who wrote the life of Prophet Muhammad. His name is Sir William Meyer. Now, when I use a reference, you notice that I use Christian references and I give you a specific name and everything, and instead of just giving you a unknown reference. There is probably, this was written 2 centuries ago, there is probably in the world no other book which has remained 12 centuries with so pure a text. Now, this was 2 centuries ago. Now we can say it is 14 centuries now. Now, you produce for me a book using the same measuring stick, the same criteria that can match the Quran. I will be more than delighted to discuss it with you. Thank you.
My remaining minute would be just used to comment on this question of abrogation. Well, if you look into the Bible quite clearly, you will find that there have been abrogation within the Old Testament, like changing the place of killing or sacrifice. You will find abrogation between the Old Testament and New Testament when Jesus is interpreted to have said that he forbade divorce. You will find abrogation within the New Testament itself. Jesus never ate pork, yet Paul, said that, or Peter have his dream. And Jesus himself was circumcised. Paul, he said it was not beneficial. Now, why on one hand, for example, we hear some of our Christian brethren like Dr. Woodbury says, no, but this is progressive revelation, but when it comes to Islam, no, this is a difficulty with Islam. In fact, if you look at it in the proper sense, really, you'll find that one meaning of abrogation, one meaning of it, actually is that nothing really is abrogated, but there have been a rule that superseded the other for a certain purpose to get people used and to move them from a lower state to a higher state. The classical example of this is in the Quran. Islam came in when people used to drink like fish. Now, how could the Quran say, stop drinking immediately, and you know that you need time for detoxification? So it started to discourage them. The first verse say that the wine and alcohol may have benefits and harms, but the harms are more than benefit. And then it moves one step further. Don't go to prayers when you're intoxicated. And since you have to pray 5 times a day, the only time you can drink is after night prayer so that you can be sober enough for the early morning prayer. Then finally came the final verse, say, don't stop. It doesn't mean that the first 2 are abrogated. Still, you don't pray when you're intoxicated. Still, it is true that drinking has more harms than benefit. But in terms of legal rule, it has been totally forbidden for the Muslim to do. But there are more to be said about abrogation also.
Thank you. All of you, please.
Okay.
Dr.
Let me just say, in reference to the text being the original exactly as it was said by Muhammad or conveyed through Muhammad, Again, I'm quoting from Suyuti Itqan, Part 2, page 1. Abdullah ibn Umar reportedly said, "Let none of you say, 'I have got the whole of the Quran.' How does he know what all of it is? Much of the Quran has gone. Let him say instead, 'I have got what has survived.'" So,
Can you give the reference in hadith, because there is a particular methodology to distinguish between weak and fabricated words, and Suyuti is a scholar, he could make the mistake. Can you give me whether this is in the two important references in hadith? Is it in Bukhari or Muslim?
But I will give you, yes, Bukhari.
Not on
will
Bukhari.
give you an example.
No, this is not in Bukhari. What you're saying is not in Bukhari, I know that for sure.
No, I said I will give you an example of the kind of thing. I'm not just saying there's parts missing.
I think if you have some familiarity, you finish with this? You finish with it?
Yes, no, I'm not.
Sorry, go
not,
ahead.
I'm not
Go ahead.
finished.
I respond to that.
I'm merely saying that you were talking about Suyuti as being an example of textual criticism. And Suyuti, first of all, quotes Abdullah ibn Amr as saying that I have what has survived. Let none of you say, "I have got the whole Quran." How does he know what it is? Much of the Quran has gone. Now, let me give two examples of verses that are given that are no longer in the Quran. One is Bukhari.
Listen to this, please.
One is Bukhari quoting Zaid. "A verse from Surah Ashab was missed by me when we copied the Quran. I used to hear Allah's apostle recite it. So we searched and found it with Khuzaimah ibn Thabit al-Ansari, Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 6, page 479. It was Surah 33, verse 23. So here was one they found but hadn't been in the collection. Here's another one, though, that Umar, this is in Ibn Ishaq, Sirat Rasulullah, page 684. Umar refers to, quote, the passage on stoning, end quote, for adultery, and quoted in Ibn Ishaq, but apparently is not in the present text. So here are at least examples of where Muslim scholars are finding that there are gaps in the text.
Okay, first of all, I think we should make it clear, again, that most of these references are none of which is made to one single authentic reference in Islam, and I'll respond to the quotation that you referred to Bukhari, which is again misunderstood, misinterpreted. When you refer to As-Suyuti, Ibn Ishaq, or Ibn Kathir, lots of scholars have indicated that these were scholars. They tried their best, but many of them included in their collection weak narrations. They included sometimes strong narration and weak narration. That's why I was asking you, what source of that? Suppose Suyuti say that, what is his reference? And since the science of hadith methodology and verification has gone through a very meticulous stage, later scholars were able to sift through all of these reports, including whatever Suyuti, he's a human being, Ibn Ishaq or others, to point out to some of the weak narration that they mentioned and the stronger ones. Furthermore, some scholars even would go further than that, and they say that some of those writers, including Ibn Kathir, for example, might have assumed that their readers are scholarly and they have the means of verification and examining the authenticity of stories, so they just reported the stories as they are without making commentary. This is sometimes has been said about Ibn Ishaq. Secondly, when you're talking, for example, about the narration, that somebody says that I don't have all the Quran, this was a mistake on the part of Ibn Umar, and the other companions corrected him. And like I said, it does not appear anywhere in any authentic collection of hadith. The only one that you mentioned is the one in Bukhari, and that is gravely misunderstood. That actually proves that the main way of preserving the Quran has been memorization. Writing in full was there, but the most important single one was memorization. How did Zayd know that there is one verse missing? He meant here missing in writing. In other words, his function was to verify the written manuscript with the memorizers of the Quran in public. So he knew that there is one verse missing. That means he memorized it, he knows it, and that's why he's looking around. And it happened that unlike other verses in the Quran that you find 5, 6 or more manuscripts containing the same verse many people have written at that time, it so happened that that ayah or that verse at that time was only available with Khuzaymah. By the way, it doesn't mean that this was the only writing, because other companions were away in other parts of the Muslim land and maybe they had the manuscripts with them. So he found that written one, which means that he knew that something was there. So all of these arguments really seem to miss two important points. First, the methodology of verification of hadith, and many of the Christian writers unfortunately keep fishing for some of those weak narration, and they leave aside the tremendous consistent evidence that is found in the Quran itself, about itself, as well as in the more authentic type of hadith. The second problem with them also is again the lack of understanding that the Quran was preserved by memorization, and Al-Hallaj did not have any modification of the Quran. For your information, what was added later on was vowel signs in accordance with the way Muslims memorized the Quran generation after generation directly from the mouth of the Prophet.
Well, I'm not going to jump into this fray, but I would say that
Please do if you have something, no problem.
that if you would say, is the Quran the Word of God, and underline the, then of course, if I believed it was the Word of God, as Muslims do, then of course one would become a Muslim. So I think we come back to the whole idea of the concept of revelation. Can it be a word from God? Is there a word of God in the Quran for me? I would say yes. I would say that there are verses and sections that are very moving, and when I read them, I feel that there is a message that God can have a word for me through the Quran. For me, of course, the norm is the New Testament, is the Gospel. If, in a sense, the Quran denies or contradicts or goes against what I have believed to be true about Jesus the Christ, about the Gospel.
Could I suggest that we stick to the topic? Because we keep straying to the New Testament. I didn't talk about the New Testament.
Yes.
Let's stick to
Yes.
the topic.
That's fine. He's still having a point. I see his point. He does have a point.
That it's the New Testament that norms my reading of the Quran. So I would say yes, it can be for me a word from God, and that there are parts of it where I feel that this is true. I mean, obviously, if I believed it like you did, then one would become a Muslim.
I'll take a few seconds and let my colleagues say. I think you're like.
Are you finished, Dr. Vagalar, first?
Sticking to technical.
Are you done with your statement?
Well, then I would also want to say that I think that within, as I've read the Quran and listened to Muslims that talk about the Quran as the uncreated Word of God, that there is the same problem there as Christians have within the incarnation. That is, there is the kalima, there are the words, the paper, the ink, which can be torn up and burned, if you will, destroyed. But there is also the kalam of God in the Quran, which cannot be destroyed. Okay? Even if you destroy the Quran as a book, you cannot destroy, as it were, the kalam of God. And Muslims have gone on to say that there is a distinction between the kalam of God and the that of God. Okay? It's a distinction, a tamyiz there. I would say that from a Christian point of view, as I've reflected on this over the years, that Christians have said that there is the kalima, if you would be like the humanity of Jesus, and that the kalam of God would be like the divinity of Jesus. And that just as Muslims make a distinction between the kalam of God and the that of God, so Christians make a distinction between the Son of God, or Jesus as we use the analogy, the Son of God, and the Father. It's a distinction, it's not a difference. It's not two gods. God stayed in heaven and sent Jesus. But that there is this distinction that is drawn between the two. That's why we need the doctrine of the Trinity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
I think it would be unfair to the Muslim side to raise many questions about the Quran and take the time to make testimonial about topics that has been covered before. We heard that so many times, the testimony. Let's devote the time to respond to the questions raised. And I believe that, Dr. Vogler, I think you have been nitpicking when you say the book. I never said or implied at all that the Quran is the only word of God. That would actually contradict what the Quran itself says, that God revealed his revelation, i.e. his word, also to previous prophets. But since you know Arabic, when you read, for example, in the Surah At-Tawbah, حَتَّى يَسْمَعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ. Kalam here does not appear with the article al, the. Yet when you translate it into English, you have to use the to make the meaning flowing. Otherwise you translate it so that he hears word of God or words of God. You have to use that. So I think it's a sort of sticking really to technicality. Even the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, when it says ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ, the book, it does not mean that there was no other book, because the Quran itself says there were. But it means the book, par excellence, at the present time, when the Quran was revealed. This is the only book that is purely and completely word of God, purely and completely preserved. So it's not really nitpicking on the use of that.
Thank you.
The Quran was not revealed in English.
I have
Doctor.
a comment related to that.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I do appreciate what Harold said that about that he will use the New Testament as his norm to when he approaches the Quran. I have no problem with that, none whatsoever, but we have to put things in perspective, and we have to compare apples with apples. So when it comes to the authenticity of the books and when it comes to the preservation of the books, we have also to compare apples with apples. So I have here with me the King James Version of the Bible, to which I have referred to earlier, and I have the reference for Dr. Woodbury about the date also of John. And I find it very interesting that in the book of Revelation, in the introduction of it, it says, through the ages, some doubt has been cast upon the authenticity of this book. Now, I do not see how you can compare that then to the Quran, or how can you use that to judge the Quran if the Christian writers themselves and Christian theologians themselves in the King James Version telling us that authenticity of it had, no, it is not off the topic. I'm responding to his remark that he's judging it based on the New Testament. So how can you judge the Quran based on the New Testament, in which Christian scholars themselves are doubting the authenticity of the books of the New Testament?
The Quran tells you to judge by our own
Say, first of all, whatever notes are in there weren't put in by the King James writers, because they only translated the scripture. So I don't know who put in the notes there, but I read you more recent scholarship, which makes the writing of John even earlier than previously thought, and certainly within the lifetime of John. And then what's interesting about that is we have the John Rylands Papyri from the year 130. We've got written materials in a very comparable way to what you have for the Quran, written materials that come after a period of oral tradition.
Okay, Dr. Jeffrey, please.
Sure.
Yes. Well, in any case, I think that all belonged in the last session anyway, the discussion about the New Testament or the Bible. But in any case, I just wanted to say that I think now and then both sides have been guilty of one thing, and that's sort of, probably myself as well, a bit guilty of interpreting things to suit ourselves. And just to give two quick examples. One, as Dr. Bedawi mentioned, is the one about Mary being the sister of Aaron. I think when we take an approach like that, we do have to realize that we have to give the benefit of the doubt to the culture that it comes from and the setting that it comes from. When we say that, Mary is and the Muslim offers in response that that's a typical type of expression in Semitic culture, that has to be taken with a high degree of legitimacy. And it always pains me when I see critics of Islam make those sort of statements. Similarly, I could say about a statement in the New Testament, for example, just as comparison, I don't believe that this is the author's intention, but when Paul says Jesus is the rock from which the children of Israel received water in the desert, I don't think he's committing a terrible anachronism there, or that he's committing pantheism. I know that in that cultural setting, that a symbol was used before to say something about the divine word, and knowing that, I know that he's not guilty of what I say. So I think we have to give some benefit to the context, the cultural context. The other point I wanted to make is, though, I do want to stress one other point Dr. Bedawi made, and I think it's, for American Muslims, those that have become Muslim, this is a very important point. And they've been very impressed by this part about the Quran. I wish we could discuss it more. If people have objections, they could raise it more. The Quran does seem to always leave itself out and out, or not even an out, as Dr. Bedawi said, when it discusses certain elements of natural science, for example. It seems to be have a remarkable similarity to what we have come to know. And the other thing is, even more importantly, it doesn't really seem to contradict what we have accepted as a scientific fact. And this has really impressed many American Muslims. For example, I mean, in the there's just no blatant contradictions. For example, in the New Testament, at some place, Paul says that if you, just like our resurrection is sort of like a seed has to die before it could come to life. And any scientist today will tell you, no, that's not true. If a seed dies, it'll never come to life. The Quran uses similar sort of, and I think it's a beautiful comparison anyway, but the Quran uses similar sort of similarities, you know, from nature and things to make greater points and reveal greater truths. But the American Muslims that have become Americans that have become Muslim have been very impressed by the fact that it doesn't really, like I said, it really can never be cornered into showing that it's contradicts some well-established fact, or contradicting something. You know, I'm not trying to sell Islam here, but I just think it's an important point that Dr. Bedawi made, and I think it should be addressed.
Thank you. Please.
Well, I just want to work.
The floor is to you.
We'll work on two levels here. Dudley was speaking some of the specifics of the Quran and showing there are specific references in the Quran that would give reason for any honest observer to say that there appear to be inconsistencies and errors. I was trying also to deal on this higher level, and I frankly am not yet quite satisfied that I have gotten an answer to this whole issue of abrogation. Because even though you say that the abrogation is in the Bible itself, you remember the Bible is spread out over centuries, and the Quran is given in a period for 22, 23 years. And so if there's a major change, then this is something quite different in scope. And then another thing, in the Bible itself never makes the book itself in any way to be a manifestation of an attribute of God, so that for a Christian to have a change over time is something that is within reason. A historical process is taking place, but when almost within the blink of an eye, as it were, within a short 23-year period, you have presumably God saying one thing, which is perfect and been there for eternity, and then maybe not reversing it, but adding something or changing something, that raises the question philosophically of, well, surely God could have done better at the beginning. Surely God, if he intended, he would know this, and he would be able to give that which is the perfect rendition of his will, rather than making a correction. And then there's always the problem of which, if there is abrogation, which verses abrogate what, and this is very fuzzy and unclear. It then renders the Quran itself subject to anyone coming along in the name of Islam and saying these verses are abrogated and these are not, and then all the debates about which verses are abrogated. So then you're left theoretically with an authority, but in practice, you're uncertain.
Example of any abrogation that causes theological problem. Just one example.
Okay. Well, if we abrogate an ayah or consign it to oblivion, we offer something better. Now.
No, I'm giving an example.
Okay, the
example
wine.
That's something that causes problem.
You talked about the wine.
Yeah.
You talked about the
Yes.
wine. So this is one case where you have differences there. Now your explanation maybe satisfy you. It doesn't satisfy me.
There's no difference.
But But are you denying that there is abrogation?
What is the difference?
Are you
here?
denying that there is
No,
abrogation?
you explain to me
well,
because I understand abrogation different from the way you're talking about. But I'm asking you simply for an
then
example.
What is this for?
Where
It
is
says
the
it talks
contradiction?
about it.
Huh?
He's offering something better. So there was something
I
there.
come to comment on that
and
verse.
then God gives something better. Well, why didn't God
Do you know what this
do
verse
the
is
best thing in
referring
the
to?
first place?
I think
I
you're
can't understand. I'd like you to explain that.
Can you give an example? The question is
I'm
there an
asking
example so that
I
we
gave
can...
the example
of an
mine,
abrogation that causes any theological argument.
Just a second, Dr. Jamal.
One example.
If there is
Well,
no
I just had
example,
the-
we can move to another point.
issue. They have
That's
three
not a
different-
problem.
3 different stands. Okay, well, I'm
I'll
sure all
explain.
of them will be no problem. But I'm dealing with the issue of abrogation itself.
Can you, Dr.
That in
Chastain,
principle, a philosophical, well, you're getting off on an issue that avoids the thrust of my point. My point is philosophically here, the fact that you have an unchangeable God, a God who is omniscient. He knows the end from the beginning. He's creating, well, he's not creating. There is a book that is eternal with God.
Okay.
Well,
Fair enough.
What is the explanation for this?
Fair enough. Fair enough. I must say, in all due respect, that you seem to confuse two things. One is known as naskh or abrogation, and the other is known as bada'. Bada' means actually basically that God did something or decided on something, then he discovered that he was mistaken, and so he had to change that in a later time. This idea is totally contrary to Islam. This idea actually was upheld by Paul. For example, in Hebrew chapter 7 verse 18, he says that when some commandment has been negated, it is either because it is weak or unuseful, which means God at one time gave us weak or unuseful commands. Or, for example, in Hebrew chapter 8 verse 7, when he says that if the first testament was perfect, you would have not needed a second testament. So this naskh or abrogation in that sense, that's not naskh, that's actually bada'. It is totally contrary to Islam. There have been in the history of Islam some people who made that claim, but they were regarded as really totally out, with very minor bubble that came and went. As far as our understanding of naskh, there are different views, yes, on that. There's no question about that. But I must bring to your attention that if you look at the context of the verse that you are reciting to us, that it doesn't deal with that at all. It deals with the jealousy that was shown by the people of the book when Allah chose to send a messenger from the Arabs. You go to the verses before that. See? About the rahmah of Allah of sending a messenger from the Arabs. Then it says, when Allah decides to, again, naskh here does not abrogate. The word abrogate is not quite correct. Actually, I called it in my tapes supersession. When Allah sent a command to supersede a previous one, He brings something like it or better, which means that if Allah chose to send the Quran, because they used also to question the authority and authenticity of the Quran, say, why do we need the Quran? The Bible is there. So the Quran came to respond to them. مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ. Whenever we supersede a previous revelation, i.e. the Bible, we will bring something like it or better, i.e. the Quran. This is the context of the verse. The example you have given us, which is the sole example you didn't give actually, the sole example I gave myself, I took initiative of raising it, about drinking, has absolutely nothing to do with the question of implementation of Islamic law or any theological question. No theology involved. Nor does it has anything to do with the implementation of Islamic law, because there is ample information available in hadith about what happened about the gradual prohibition of drinking. It does not negate the first two verses, because still, like I said earlier, you should not pray while you are intoxicated. It's not abrogated. It's simply superseded, that you get a stronger command from Allah, as He, in His divine wisdom, also used the term progressive, used also commands to get people gradually from the state of jahiliyyah or ignorance they were on to the state of purity, which required to give them some time to get detoxified. But as far as implementing the law, now of course drinking is totally prohibited. But it doesn't mean, actually the fact that it remained in the Quran shows that it is the word of Allah. As far as saying that Allah did not know that, this is totally irrelevant. Allah knew also that human beings evolve in stages. At some times He might reveal certain things to certain people. The legal aspect could change over time. But the basic theology, the basic information about Allah, the hereafter, purity, moral teaching, we don't believe that this has been subject to any abrogation. Legal aspect could undergo some superstition, as I prefer to call it.
May I add something?
This is what medical experts today talk about gradual withdrawal from alcohol. And this was established in the Quran 1400 years ago. So this actually confirms, 1400 years ago there was no medical doctor in Arabia to fully understand that if you are an alcoholic, you cannot just get away from the bottle like that. There was a gradual thing. So that in itself is a miraculous arrangement, and that shows that God Almighty knows the nature of alcohol and knows the nature of the human more than you and I knew, and more than the scientists knew.
Thank you. It's your turn now, please.
I was troubled when I was studying at the University of Riyadh under a Muslim professor when he would say on occasion, here are the rules of Arabic, and then he would say the Quran is different here. Because this only concerns me because the Quran is given as the standard of Arabic. And let me just refer to one which Muslim scholars themselves are aware of, and there are others like this. But for example, in Surah 2, verse 177, you have two words that are in a parallel structure. And you have mufun in the nominative or
Mufun?
Yes, mufun in the nominative case. But then in the same grammatical structure, in a poetic grammatical structure, you have sabirin, which is accusative or genitive. It is not the nominative case. And if one of the evidences that the Quran is the Word of God is that it is perfect Arabic, unless you just say that this is perfect and so the grammar rules are wrong, this at least raises questions.
Please, just a second. Would you explain this problem? It's a grammatical.
It's no problem at all.
It's a problem in grammar. So
it's no problem at all.
No. For the benefit of the audience, explain first.
No, I'm not going through that.
Essentially,
yes.
The two words. The first word is in the nominative. That is a subject.
It should be sabirun instead of sabirin.
Sabirun would put it the parallel word in the nominative.
That's what you're saying. It should have been sabirun instead of sabirin.
By the normal rules of grammar.
Number one, I must say that actually, when the Quran challenged the Arabs, it was so beautiful and so perfect that the Quran itself was used by the literalists themselves to set new rules even of the Arabic language. Number one. Number two, I'd like to refer to you to a book that I did check, Fiqh al-Lugha, by Dr. The one who was assassinated in Lebanon, Dr. Subhi Saleh. And you find that some of the superficial remarks made sometimes by some literalists, I'm not talking about non-Muslims, even some Muslims themselves, about rules of Arabic are too superficial, because this is a very scholarly work that indicates that in fact there are sometimes lots of exceptions to the rules which is built in the Arabic language, which is acknowledged even in terms of the literary works that has been done even before Islam. So there is no problem at all with that. Number three, I'd refer you also to another thing that even explains it further and better. The works of Sheikh Muhammad Musri Sha'rawi, whose specialty actually is the analysis why the Quran put it this way and not that way. So on the superficial on the surface of it, a linguist might say, all right, that seemed to be a departure from the commonly held rule in the Arabic language. But it is the duty of a mufassir like Sheikh Sha'rawi when he points out in a most amazing way that for each of these variations in terms of the departure from a common grammatical rule, which is not ultimate anyway, common grammatical rule, there is a very good and awful reason behind that. Let me just give you one quick example of this that may sound on the surface again as contradiction.
I have an answer for this.
You have an answer also? Okay, I restrain myself.
Go ahead.
Okay. We haven't heard the answer yet to the example that he quoted. So please.
Okay,
I say again, refer to the linguist. There is no basis here. There is no hard and fast rule that you say you can put it this way.
I was heading to Dr. Gamal to finish his introduction. If you finish, I will. Can I?
I lost my. You want to finish first?
No. Okay. Okay. See, Dr. Woodbury, the word wal-mufun refers to people who fulfill their commitments, right? It's coming in the subjective way. The word as-sabirin, it is a reflection of a status. That's why it used the the adverb rather than the subject status. And that is very well known grammatically in Arabic. I can check with you. I have the references. I can show them to you. If you're not satisfied, I will take you home at my own expenses. But see, the sabirin, those who are patient, we're talking about a continuous status. But the ones who are mufun, they fulfill. It is talking about a subject versus an object. They fulfill their promises. They fulfill their commitment. But the sabirin, it is not they sabaru, it is they have been sabirin. Did I answer your question, Dr. Bain?
Well, you gave an answer. I'm not sure it's the correct answer. And again, I'm not a great Arab scholar, but it's certainly, if the Quran is in plain Arabic, as it says it is, so that the common reader should be able to understand it in that day.
Not necessarily so, excuse me. The common reader of the Bible cannot understand the Bible without asking a scholar. Just apply this simple rule to the Quran. Give us what you give to the Bible reader.
Well, I'm quoting the Quran when it says it is in plain Arabic.
Yes,
but among the eloquent Arabic, that's what is
we have 4
Okay.
minutes, please. So let us restrict ourselves
And,
to concluding this part.
Let's just say this has caused Muslim scholars, and this is just one example, has caused Muslim scholars questions.
The example is
And,
answered.
A linguist.
Thank you. May I please?
There
Thank
is
you.
another verse I want to draw your attention to, the verse that says, وَالْمُقِيمِ الصَّلَاةِ. It uses the same thing in emphasis of the repetitive act. This is a rule that is known in Arabic as well. In poets, people use the same thing in poems. The poets use the special rule to emphasize a special meaning by giving the continuous status of something rather than giving it the normal one.
Thank you. Dr. Wagner, please.
Just a question. When Muslims approach the Quran from a hermeneutical point of view, what are some of the questions that are asked of the text? And I think, if we could have a list of those questions that the mufassirun would ask of any text as they approach it, I think this might help us to see how we perhaps approach the text in different ways. What would be some of the questions, the hermeneutical questions that they ask?
I'd rather address the question that was raised earlier because I think that is more important. I think there is a distinction between grammar as one of the sub-areas in the study of Arabic and the science of eloquence or balagha. And balagha does not necessarily follow all the rules of grammar. That's well known in Arabic. Again, you can check fiqh al-lugha by Dr. Subhi Salih on this. And just to give you one example of this, that's something that would strike a superficial observer as something which is untenable in the Quran. Yet, ilm al-balagha, not the grammar, would solve that problem. 2 verses in the Quran. One says, don't kill your children because of female infant. Don't kill your children for fear of poverty because we provide for them and for you. Another verse says, don't kill your children because of poverty we provide for you and for them. And some people say, why is that repetition in the Quran? Why in one time it says, we provide for them and you, even though they have not been born yet, or just small? In one case it says, we provide for you and them. Why is the difference? Is that just a kind of playing with words? No. If you look at it carefully, as Sheikh Sha'rawi explained, and that's again no grammatical grammatician can explain. He says in the first verse, it says, don't kill your children for fear of future poverty, which means you may not be poor now, but you're afraid, if you have children, that you may get poor, that you will share the wealth that you have. So the more appropriate thing is to assure you that when the child arrives, he arrives with a provision, with the rizq. So what is needed to assure the person more is that don't worry about the future provision for that child. God will provide for that child as he provides for you. Whereas in the other verse, it says, don't kill your child because of poverty, because you are poor now, because we provide for you and them. Don't worry, you are poor now. We provide for you and for them. This is one of the most amazing, and there are hundreds of examples like that. So let's not quote grammaticians. Let's refer also to those who understand the Quran.
Thank you. You still have a point here to make?
Can you repeat your question, Dr. Berger? I didn't really get your point.
Well, when a preacher or a mufassir, interpreter, approaches the Quranic text, what are some of the questions that he asks of the texts
قواعد التفسير.
in order to interpret it properly? What?
Okay. You want me to answer? Sure. Yeah, there are a number of questions, and actually many of these questions developed into separate sub-sciences of the Quran. It is wrong to say that there is a science of the Quran. There are sciences of the Quran. There are voluminous, and I get surprised when people say, oh, Muslims did not expose their scripture in the same way that Christians did for critical examination. And one of those sciences, first of all, to interpret the Quran, first of all, you have to read it and refer to the linguistic origin. The words, what do these words mean in the Arabic language? Secondly, you have to consider balagha, because Quran is the ultimate of eloquence. So you have to consider also the usage and the variations of use and what secrets could be behind it, just like the two verses I analyzed now. Number three, if there is information available, and oftentimes it is, about the reasons for revelation. That is, the Quran was revealed to comment on certain events. It doesn't mean that it's not eternal, because God knew from time immemorial that these events are going to happen, and this is His word to give the command. So you have to find out the reason of revelation, or else you will be misinterpreting the verse. Number four, you have to consider also how that particular verse fit in the section where it is mentioned. Just like the comment made earlier about the Quran, about abrogation or bringing something better. If you relate it to the verse, it speaks about God replacing the Bible with the Quran. Simple and pure. So you have to see the context of the section. 5, you have to see the context of the surah also, or the chapter of the Quran where it deals with this. 6, you cannot interpret it in a way that would contradict other texts in the Quran, because the Quran was not written by several authors. It's all revealed at one time through one person. So Quran explains itself. So one cannot pick and choose and say the Quran says here and then ignore other verses that deal with the same subject. You collect all the text. Number 6, and this is very important, is that as the Quran itself directs Muslims, whoever obeys the Prophet, he is obeying Allah, which means that a second primary, not secondary, I mean it's a second primary source of Islam is the authenticated, I'm not saying the weak, authenticated hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because he shed light on the interpretation and understanding of the Quran. Number 8, you could also ask a question as to how, if you don't have enough indication of this, how did the companions of the Prophet who were close to him, who absorbed the knowledge of Islam through the example, words, and the action of the Prophet, understood it? Not necessarily that's as decisive as his word, but it shed some light on that understanding. These are some of the fundamental questions before one jumps to conclusion that it means
Thank
this
you,
or that.
Dr. Jamal.
I have to add some points.
We have to conclude, so...
I have to add just some quick points, 1 minute or less.
1 minute, make it less then.
Okay. See, one major point, Dr. Jagger, is that the Quran has been revealed in Arabic. So if Dr. Chaston cannot say an-Nasafi, as I say it, I wonder how would he do when he goes into the Quran, reading the Quran itself. An-Nasafi is a simple word. I'm not picking, but just it is the fact that the language is important. I don't know Aramaic. If I have a book in Aramaic and I study Aramaic for 2 years or 10 years, that doesn't make me an Aramaic. But I go to the references. So being an Arab is important. Oh, and the Arab is the person who can read, write, speak, and understand Arabic. It is not by nationality or birth.
Thank you.
Anyone who can.
The list is finished.
Okay.
Now, may I just respond
Yes,
to that since you referred to me? I am very sorry I'm not an Arab expert. I'm sorry about that. But there's an implication here that is very important. If God is giving a book that is showing the way of light, and then there's no way that can be adequately translated, it means that there's an ethnocentrism built into the very revelation of God. There is a limitation. Only the person who has the money or the opportunity or the chance to learn Arabic can actually get at the truth. And this is fundamentally unfair to the bulk of the world, which is not Arabic. And so the very idea shows a certain linguistic ethnocentrism, which to me suggests that this is not given for the entire world, or if given to the entire world, it imposes upon them an obligation which they will not be able to fulfill, because how can I judge the Quran if I live in Zimbabwe or if I live in China?
You get a translation in your language.
And I cannot evaluate whether this is a unique book at all. So your point, I think, is a double-edged weapon. It is a disproof of the uniqueness.
I think you can.
Please.
You can apply
we
the
have
same
to conclude.
Exactly.
So we have to conclude and then come back. We still have 1.5 hours.
Okay.
We can extend it.
Yeah,
we'll
30 seconds.
Yeah, same topic.
30 seconds.
30
seconds.
We still have 1.5 hours.
We'll come back in an hour and a half.
We come back to
on
the
this.
same topic. Please. We have now a break. It's the time for the break. Thank you very much, and we'll come back to the same
You'll have
topic.
a chance. You'll have a chance.
Okay, we'll come to that.
A little bit more the development of things I've already said further, but I don't need to. Do you want to raise the question of
Can you start?
of what are their struggles and so forth, or do you feel they'll be willing to answer in public?
I have a feeling, just talking with that here, that's not his style at all.
Okay. Do you still want to raise it? Or?
Yeah. What would be our questions of hermeneutics? I mean, he listed 8 of those when you approach a Quranic text, and when we approach the Bible, what are the questions that we even ask of the text?
Okay. Historical, grammatical, historical.
Yes, historical, grammatical, authorship. I mean, we have I think we have quite a different set of questions that we approach the text with, which just, I think, is indicative of how differently we see the text.
Okay. Is there anything more you're anxious to say?
I was just going to, I thought it might be good to have a summary at the end to go over and maybe bring up, I don't know if you feel right, if it's okay, but I have a sheet here, and I probably have it downstairs.
Verses of the last explanation. I mean, we need to get some other examples. I didn't bring along all of my material.
As somebody is saying, this is time out. So.
I didn't expect them to
Getting time out now.
accept that. I thought the minimum, there were 5 that the minimum number, and then over 30 some others acknowledged in general. So I didn't expect to have to justify that. But so I didn't bring a list with me. I was looking, I thought I had a list. But I do have a couple of them right here. Did you have your Quran?
You finished your timeout?
186. If you want to get
Finished your timeout?
I don't know if these are abrogation or not. And here's another one. Is Surah 224 abrogated by 4?
We'll start with
I don't know, but he was asking me for examples, but I didn't have them.
You ready?
Yes.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Translation. Question
about using the Arabic language. You may want to let them repeat the question so that someone can question.
You'll have to repeat it so we can repeat it.
I have it here.
Something about
I have it here.
You mean you want me to repeat my statement?
You will hear the answer.
You want me to repeat my statement?
But
No, I have
You
the
challenged me and I answered back.
I have
Is that
the
what you want to repeat or what?
Not challenge, but the point about using the Arabic language and the limitation that this does to God getting access.
I thought
to
I would
people.
start raising my hand now. Okay.
is that something you want to follow through?
Well, they want to follow through. I'm willing to, because see, I want to spend the time on the issues that they have to grapple with, so just
How much should we start?
to make points.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Oh, well, I just wanted to make an observation about the business of translations of the Quran. For Muslims, this had been an important issue at some stage. Muslims have always guarded, somewhat, not a painful issue, but a very important issue. There was a slight bit of controversy attached to it. The question arose, faced with the fact that over 85% of the Muslim population was at a certain stage non-Arab, how to get the Muslim Ummah, to the great majority of the Muslim Ummah, to understand their revelation. And after some debate, it was finally decided that it was all right, of course, to interpret the Quran in other languages, and such interpretations were made. And of course, I'm a product of that, and or at least my becoming a Muslim. And the only thing I would like to contribute to that, and the only further observation I would like to make, is that it does show that with what strictness Muslims always tried to guard the integrity of the Quran. They felt that they even considered the fact that by interpreting it in other languages, you somehow could lead to misunderstandings. But of course, the necessity outweighed that caution. The last point I would like to make about that is, let's see, what else do I have around here? No, I guess that's more or less about it. If Shakir, you would like to add something to this? Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Shakir, just let me finish this point. There is a critical issue that Muslims always stress, and that is when, since the Quran is the revealed word of God in Arabic, any translation of the Quran is not really considered, Muslims avoid using the term translation. They would rather use the term interpretation, because every translation technically from any language into another language really is interpretation in any case. But once again, that's the idea of being technically correct in saying that a translation or an interpretation is not the same as the original word of God. I don't know, I just thought that was a point I should address.
Can I add something? Likewise, with any language, the language is a vehicle of meanings. And there is no two languages who are 100% compatible. So when the Quran was named as Arabiyyun Mubin, a clear, pure Arabic tongue in which the Quran was revealed, it is also a hint from God subhanahu wa ta'ala that this Quran is there to be forever in this tongue forever. And that's also one of the miracles of the Quran, that for 1400 years until today, it is still recited in Arabic. Those who memorize the Quran from the non-Arabs are much more outnumbered to the number of Arabs who memorize the Quran. Not only that, Bukhari, who is the first book recognized after the Quran as the most authentic collection of the teachings of the Prophet, is collected and compiled by a man called Bukhari himself, attributed to him. He is a non-Arab. Second to it is a book, Muslim, also is made by an imam from Naysabur, a little bit in southern Russia. The great Mufassir al-Qurtubi is from Spain. He was also a non-Arab. So Arabic has never been a hindrance factor in the way of understanding or even reaching the degree of scholarship in the knowledge and the mastery of the Quran and the knowledge of Islam.
Well, I'm not talking about scholarship. I'm sure there are very many profound Muslim Arab scholars or non-Arab Muslim scholars. My point that I was making is that Christians glory in the fact that the Bible is translatable and it is authoritative in the various languages that it goes into. We are not locked into one language, and this is a kind of a linguistic ethnocentrism that Christianity doesn't have, because the premise from the very beginning is that this is going to be a universal faith. But I, as an American, feel that if forever I will be locked out because I don't have the time or the opportunity, or for whatever reason, the money it takes to go study Arabic, that I will never be able to assess really whether the Quran meets its claims, because ultimately the Islamic religion is based on the Quran, and if I can't get at the source then, according to Islamic doctrine, then I am always, in a sense, a second-class citizen spiritually, unless I am willing to be Arabized. And then this is what you may have to have. The world has to be, as it were, Arabized in order for it to come into the fullness of the understanding of the Islamic, of the religion. Now, this to me is an argument against my accepting the religion.
Yes, Americans or non-Arab speaking Muslims, I'm sure don't feel left out of the community. But if that's your or if that's what your fear is, they'll assure you they're not. But the point of it is that even even a non-Arabic speaking Muslim acknowledges that, you know, he might approach this in several ways. He might get 6 or 7 different interpretations and compare them and try to get a little bit closer. Like you said, many do try to learn Arabic. I've been studying it for 4 years now. But the issue is really, he knows that sometimes what he's reading is somebody's understanding of it, and this is the best he could do with. It's a practical disadvantage. But on the other hand, we do appreciate that sometimes what we might be reading is not quite accurate. For example, there's a verse in the Quran that says, "Qul a'udhu birabbil falaq min sharri ma khalaq," and it goes like that. And it says, read in the name of your Lord who created man from and the word used is alaq. And in most English translations, this is just a brief example, in most English translations they translate that word as blood clot because it rhymes with the thing and it sounds nice in English. But as a matter of fact, that word does not say God created you of a blood clot. The original Arabic, if you go back to the ancient Arabic lexicons, is created you from a clinging, tiny worm-like creature. That's the way it was understood in the early days even before Islam, before the Quran was revealed. The point of it is that that's a significant statement. For Muslims, that's a very significant sign, because here the Quran is saying that we created you from a tiny little clinging thing. Now, some worm-like clinging creature, and for Muslims, they see that as, rightly or wrongly, as a sign. They see that as a sign of when we are first created in the womb, we are indeed a tiny little clinging worm-like creature clinging to the sides of the uterine wall. And there are other verses in the Quran that definitely show that when the Quran speaks of alaq, it's talking in the context of a creature in the womb, because it talks about the various stages of development in the womb. And again, it uses this word alaq. The only point I'm trying to make, strictly speaking, is that if you when you translate it into another language, what for Muslims is a potent sign of the divine origins of the Quran is lost. But that doesn't mean he's not going to learn the fundamental moral virtues that he's supposed to pursue, or what the meaning of life is for a Muslim, what is the meaning of the purpose of life. All these things could probably be gained through translation.
If that is so important, apparently has been lost upon. It will be lost upon all those Muslims who don't know Arabic, and other people who are thinking about it. But also apparently has been lost upon to millions of Muslims through the centuries. But let me ask you the question: was man created from a clot or a worm or dust? I thought there were 2 references in the Quran to creation.
All right, let me answer.
Is there a contradiction there? Maybe not. You would say no, of course.
No, that's a beautiful question, and you know I'm going to say no.
You're not only answering the question, you answer it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So, but the point of it is that the Quran does say that all human beings are made of clay. Of course, that means that our not just our ancestors, but actually our body composition is very much similar to clay. But the other point is, and you missed my point, is that when the Quran uses the word alaq in other contexts, it's talking about the individual in the womb, very clearly in several places in the Quran. So we have a differentiation here. But like I said, I don't expect you, if you don't want to agree with that or if you want to disagree with that, that's fine. But the point is still valid that for Muslims, they feel that a knowledge of Arabic helps them to appreciate some of these beautiful signs. They could gain knowledge of those signs through the works of Muslim writers who write and translate into English and help share that with them. I'm sure, but the point of it is I think what we're doing here is we're harping on a very obvious point, that yes, you don't have the same access to the divinely revealed word if you don't understand Arabic fluently, but nonetheless, you could still appreciate it on a very high level, and you could eventually gain. I think we're just grabbing for straws here. Don't we have anything more vital to talk about?
Okay. I think we have some more vital.
Thank you.
Is it possible to allow another minute or two just to add something to this, just to finish with this? I think as the Quran itself explains, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ لِيُبَيِّنَ لَهُم. We have not sent, God says, we have not sent any messenger except in the language of his people so as to explain to them. And the same thing happened with all of the prophets. If Prophet Moses started to speak Polish, they want to understand him. If Jesus was speaking in Chinese, he would not be able to communicate with them, number one. Number two, in the case of the Quran in particular, there are many aspects that it challenged people, their spirituality, their mind, their attitude towards the Quran. And of course, to come in a place in the world at that time that used to pride itself on the ultimate of eloquence of the Arabic language, it has to be in that language to challenge them and to show them indeed that it is not from Allah. Three, the question of translation of the Quran is no problem, and the fact that some scholars were hesitant to that, they may have their own reasons, but there is nothing in the Quran that says that you cannot translate the meaning and communicate it to other people. In fact, Muslims did when they went to other parts of the world. Fourthly, there is nothing ethnocentric about it. As the Prophet explained, Al-Arabiyyatul Lisan, Arabic is a tongue, which means that they have been in history, and names has been given already by Brother Shakir. There are many other names, even now in Pakistan and India, you find some people who speak Arabic more fluently and know it better. So it is not to be tied to one ethnic group, but simply to the language, original language of revelation, which is open for all Muslims. And finally, just 2 points. One is the question of how do you assess the miraculousness of the Quran, and could that cause confusion? The answer is no. If I don't know much about medicine, and I find that all the people who are really most famous in the medical field admitted certain fact, I don't have to be a physician myself. I don't have to understand their jargon. So by the same token, for a person who doesn't even understand Arabic, including some Arabs, by the way, who are not well ingrained in the language, having seen the witness and testimony of the best minds at the best epoch of Arabic eloquence, that should be sufficient indication that indeed it was a challenge. But if I'm not happy, we learn, we take courses, I can learn Arabic and challenge it myself if I'm not pleased with this. On the other hand, when it comes to the variations in understanding, this is not existent in the matter of essentials of faith. Whatever translation of meaning of the Quran you get, you're still talking about the 5 daily prayers, you talk about zakah, about siyam. In the matter of belief, there is no confusion. But it could make a difference, pardon? It could make a difference, yes, in some of the verses pertaining to science, which you need a scientist really to understand and to dwell, as Dr. Bouquet and others did, by themselves or with the help of Arabic scholars.
Can we make it shorter?
Yeah, what was the original expression on this? Finally, the question that you say about a possible contradiction. No contradiction. If you read the verse completely, that's the problem, again, with you and with due respect to Dr. Woodbury also. Quoting one half of the verse. Dr. Woodbury sometimes quote the first half, this time you quoted the second half. Because in Surah Al-Mu'minun, Surah number 23, it says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ. We created the human from a quintessence of dust, which means of the same material of dust, or could be the primordial type of creation. And then ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَا نَسْلَهُ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ مَاءٍ. Then we made its progeny of, again, the question of alaq or ma'in mahin, the liquid. So this is in the same verse, but you quoted the second half without the first.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jamal. Dr. Woodbury.
Just when did the worm understanding of the...
The Quran doesn't say worm. The word alaq in Arabic has 2 meanings. Worm, the alaq has 2 meanings. One, let me just explain. I think he was approximating the meaning. And this we find in the book by Dr. Bouquet and his articles. Alaq literally means something that clings. And anyone who knows Arabic, ya'laq, alaqa. Something that clings, which is a very accurate description of the fertilized ovum as it clings to the lining of the uterus. Another meaning of alaq also is the leech. A leech-like. And Dr. Bouquet has produced, and I have it also in an article here, amazingly.
My question is, when did this occur?
Just a minute. A leech-like. He produced a shape of the embryo in the early stages, and surprisingly, it looked exactly like the leech. So whether you interpret it as leech-like, you're correct. Whether you interpret it as something that clings, it's correct, because that leech-like thing clings.
Just for the people
when
that
did that translation
Dr. Jeffrey,
occur?
please,
We
give him
never
a
heard
chance.
this before. And was it before Bukhail, or is this just since his writings?
May I make...
No,
please.
I can answer that, because I heard Dr. Bouquet speaking about that himself. Dr. Bouquet and other scientists in Egypt as well, they were not satisfied with the available translations when it came to examination of areas that they do have background on. And what they did, they consulted the Arabic lexicon. They consulted with linguists, scholars in Islam. They consulted with scholars, and they came up actually to discover that there were deficiencies in this translation. But it did not affect the beliefs. It did not affect the Muslim prayers. It did affect our understanding. It increased our understanding and our reflection on the Quran the more we discover about it.
I think the analogy could be seen...
May I just move to them first before we come to you?
I would like to clarify one point.
At least let me correct myself on a reference. I gave you the wrong reference.
Please,
it's supposed to be in
it's
a
their
96
turn
or...
Reverend
This
Chastain
side
asked
there.
about this point.
Okay.
Reverend Chastain asked about
Yes,
this.
I just want to know the time when this occurred. Is it a new interpretation? Because it seems like it begins with the time of this book.
Can I answer that for him, please?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
No, I think he's right.
We do not have to argue about the scientific facts in it. The religious scientists, the people who specialize in science, non-Muslims, speak for themselves.
Oh, well, let's
This is Dr. Keith Moore, professor of embryology, the head of the dean of the School of Medicine, the University of Toronto. He is a Baptist. He is the son of a Baptist preacher. He is not a Muslim. Now, the man who is one of the top 3 experts in his field in the world, writes a book known as The Developing Embryo, and you are more than welcome to examine it. And he makes specific statements that all modern research had not been able to come up with one single statement that contradicts one single verse in the Quran or in the Hadith. Now, Dr. Bouquet, embryology. Now, Dr. Bouquet, a French Catholic, he is not a Muslim. He deals with all the scientific facts. Now, he writes a book, the Bible, the Quran, and modern science. And you can read his own conclusion that he cannot find one single, or modern science cannot come up with one single statement that contradicts one single verse in the Quran, and this is not true for the Bible. This is a French Catholic, this is a Canadian Baptist. These are not Muslims, and you are more than welcome to examine their work.
Well, you see, the point is, if you look at biblical interpretation of the Old Testament, you can find people who will find prophecies of automobiles, tanks, airplanes, all kinds of modern
Atomic
inventions.
bombs.
Okay.
And they find these in the Old Testament, and basically they're largely ridiculed, because as you understand God's revelation, what he is doing, he is not trying to make a book a little mystery thing that has no relevance to the people at the time that it's written, because as you're saying, this understanding only just occurred within our lifetime. All those centuries of Muslims before this never understood this interpretation you're just giving me now.
Exactly.
So it has no relevance.
Okay.
It
This speaks for the Quran that it is the living miracle, the ultimate miracle for all science. There is a verse in the Quran that we will show them, our science, in themselves and in the horizon. That means every generation that came since Prophet Muhammad till the day of judgment are going to find new revelations in the Quran that the previous generation did not know. Now, I am not giving you prophecies in the Old Testament that people had ridiculed. I am giving you 1990 editions of Christian scientists who are still living today, and you can go and speak to them in person. So this is not compared to the prophecies that you can find in the Old Testament.
This doesn't prove our point. Has no relevance to our point.
Can I finish? So if you are going to compare, you must compare apples with apples. That is the only logical way, and that is the only fair way to talk about it.
The point I was trying to make, I didn't mean to introduce the subject. I was trying to give an example that would show why Muslims feel that they have a great advantage in having the revelation in the language that it was originally revealed. The only other analogy I would like to draw is the fact that Christians that have that understand Hebrew and that understand Koine Greek might have a better access to the original, to the text which they believe to be their scripture. I think the analogy is obvious. I don't think it's anything difficult to understand why we might feel that we have an advantage if we're not relying on a translation, but on the original text.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr.
All right, let me just preface my remark by saying it would be well, if you're going to read Bouquet's book, to read an answer to it by a doctor, William Campbell. It is now in French. He spent 3 years preparing his response to that book, and basically concludes that you end up, according to your presuppositions, that Bouquet has certain presuppositions which pretty much determine his conclusions. And if you start out with different presuppositions, you end up with different conclusions.
Is it available in English?
In English, it is now in an English manuscript. It was sent to me 2 days ago by somebody to ask, should it be published? I have not had a chance to go through it other than this initial introduction to see whether I think it should be in English. But I would suggest that if you read one, you read both.
Yeah.
I would strongly recommend for everyone to read both of them and judge for themselves.
Yeah.
Now, one more point that I would like to make. The Quran is not a medical book or a medical textbook, and this is not a point that we are bringing to show you that the Quran is more accurate or it is so on. This is a drop in the bucket, that even the Quran challenges us today in the 20th century in America, the most advanced nation in technology, in space, in geology, in oceanography, and no human being on the face of the earth had been able to produce one valid scientific theory, even space technology, or fact that can contradict one single verse in the Quran. But we are not selling the Quran to you as a scientific book, so you can, if you want to go to space, you should read it. Okay. Now, we are mentioning that as a sign from God to a generation after generation. But obviously, this is a book of teaching, a spiritual book, and a book of ethics, and a book that can reform the life of the individual and bring him closer to God.
Okay, let me
please.
Let him go.
Let me just enter something else that is related but is another step, having to do with research and scholarship. If Muslims are so sure that the text of the Quran is correct, why do they not encourage or at least accept the study of a textual analysis? Instead, they started out burning the evidence, evidence of any alternative readings, including the texts that were much more widely accepted at the time. And then when people like Ibn Shanabuth, who lived in 245 to 328, who did refer to some of those earlier readings, which he thought were valid ones, he was forced to recant. And furthermore, I could give so many examples of this, but Arthur Jeffrey here has a list of over a page, about a page and a half, of books that just describe some of the variants. He himself has devoted the book to showing variants in the text. Other scholars, if this is true, when scholars approach it, they should arrive at the same conclusions. But here, the book by Burton, The Collection of the Quran, comes up with totally different conclusions than have been mentioned here. And yet...
about Burton's conclusions...
Would you wait, please?
Can I mention... I read the book also.
We gave you your turn at bat.
All right.
Now we have our turn at bat.
Ahead,
we gave you 3 turns at bat.
Well, give me another turn after you.
Yet, repeatedly we find this problem. Professor Bergstrasser, a German scholar of the Quran, he had heard of a text at Al-Azhar that had variant readings, and yet he was not allowed to withdraw it to see what those were. Nulde Keshwali's Geschichte der Quran is certainly in the West one of the groundbreaking books on the history of the text and so forth, and it received so much opposition that it was not even allowed to be published in Arabic. And I've given you other examples before, but Taha Hussein's paper to the 17th International Congress of Orientalists, where he discussed critically certain grammatical features of the text of the Quran, was bitterly attacked and so forth. So that it seems to me that if you are sure of something, you should allow it to be studied. If you're not sure of it, then you burn the evidence and you don't let anybody study it. But if I'm sure of something, I would let other people study it, and in this way would be sure that it would be confirmed. And I think this is one of the things that concerns us. We share our grappling with the text, but we don't find the same, to us, openness in the Muslim community. And I realize that when essentially the word became book, you might say, and for us the word became flesh, that this is a sensitive issue, and I can appreciate this. And I feel very awkward even mentioning it. But having all that being put aside, it is a concern to us.
Okay, Jeffrey first, or you want me to address some points first?
I have a quick comment, so make it.
No, I'm going to let Dr. Bedoui take it right away, but please don't feel shy about raising a point like that. I mean, that's the purpose of this whole venture.
I think we seem to be dwelling on something that has already been answered before. Apparently, we ran out of additional points to raise. Incident time of Osman, I did answer that, and they said it was done in consultation, and the Quran agreed to bring their own personal copies that had the variant readings, which were permissible by the Prophet. But again, you tend to forget again what I said quite clearly and repeatedly, that the original, let me finish, the original copy, the official copy written under the supervision of the Prophet, which was compiled together, even though it was fully available in writing, and kept in the house of Abu Bakr, the first caliph, within the first 2 years after the Prophet, and then moved into the custody of Umar, the second caliph, and after his death went to the house of Hafsa, the wife of the Prophet, which was the same copy from which the Osmani copies were compiled or written or copied and sent to the various parts of the Muslim world. This was the official copy, which was only in the reading of Quraysh, that is the tongue of the Prophet, peace be upon him. That was the official copy. I don't know on what basis are you saying that other variant readings with much more common, there is no support for that. You go to Bukhari, you go to Muslim, you find something straightforwardly contradicting what you're saying. The most common reading has been the tongue of Quraysh, And after Osman, of course, it became the most predominant one. So there is no problem at all with the question of this question of burning. Let me add also one more point, because you threw some points earlier, really, which give perhaps a false impression. When you said that the copy or the codex of Ibn Mas'ud is drastically different. That's not true. What I read about the codex of Ibn Mas'ud, which was his personal collection, that he put one surah before the other, or forgot to put the Al-Fatiha in the very beginning, which is every Muslim memorizes and uses in his prayers. And some scholars actually said that it's quite possible that he put it this way because he heard the Prophet, which is permissible, sometimes reciting in the prayer one surah or one chapter before the other. What's the trivial difference even then? But to put all of this massive evidence from the most authentic sources and to pick some of these less authentic type of narrations and to try to raise doubt about the Quran, I think it's not a very fair approach.
Please.
Just okay.
No, please.
As far as being insignificant, Ibn Mas'ud.
Can you give us an example of variations to discuss here?
I'm giving you right here the numbers of verses. Okay.
The source. I'd like the source first.
Okay.
Which authentic book of hadith does it say that? Don't tell me some other writer wrote that. What authentic original sources of hadith say that?
What the evidence for this is all in materials
That's not evidence.
For a history of the...
That's not evidence. You're referring to secondary sources. I'd like original sources. And if those secondary sources have mentioned original words of hadith, I'll buy that.
Here are the listing of the actual words and so forth, so that...
The words come from a source. What we need is the source first.
Okay, Doctor...
let me just mention that Ibn Mas'ud has omitted 19 verses and added 6 that are not. You'll find it in here.
No, I'd like to know it.
Ibn Ubay ibn Ka'b has not omitted any verses, but has added 13 verses, so that this is all based on Arabic sources, and these are based on sources by Muslims.
Arabic Muslim sources have been subjected to the scrutiny of verification, some of which are called weak, some of which are called fabricated. And you will find it in the writing of Muslims, and actually some of them write it to warn people about those weak. You have never given me one single, authentic, agreed to sources.
He's got a couple of books full here.
You can give me a pile of books. I'd like the source. That's the point I'm asking
You have
for.
no right to force him to give his arguments in a way that's pleasing to you. He can give you what he wants.
Anyone who knows the ABC, anyone who knows the ABC about Islam knows that the widely and most acceptable, scientifically speaking, in terms of the verification, are Bukhari and Muslim. There are lesser sources, there are weak sources, and even some of the books of hadith, for your knowledge, when they mention a hadith, they say this one is strong, medium, al-Hasan, or this is weak, and sometimes even say fabricated. You have not given me a single authentic source that supports this. On the other side, Bukhari and Muslim are full of contradictory things to what you have been referring to and quoting. And the point that should be remembered again and again, the Quran was preserved mainly by memorization. This is something unequal when you compare it with the Bible. Until today, you find children whose mother tongue is not Arabic in India, Pakistan, and Africa, 10 years old, memorizing the entire Quran from A to Z, and that's now, let alone the past. The Quran has been preserved by memorization, generation after generation. To say this all should be thrown out because of some flimsy references, that's not a good argument.
I gave you an example from al-Bukhari before.
I explained it to you also.
Yeah.
Well, let me give another example.
It at least showed there were some lacks, there were some gaps.
No gaps. I did explain that. Let me repeat it in case you missed it. I said that this was in reference to the collection that Zayd was making, and in addition to memorization by Zayd himself, Zayd ibn Thabit, and all the other memorizers that were verifying this, he wanted to make sure also that it should be available physically in writing. And the very fact that he says, I was looking for one verse and I found it with one person, what does that mean? That he memorized that verse. It was not lost. It was memorized by him and by others. but he wanted some documentary evidence, and he kept looking for it until he fetched it.
Hamid,
Well,
I have to add something here.
Okay, go ahead.
It's just for the purpose
But
of
please,
clarification.
remember that they have an equal chance as you do. So
Well, I'm
you have
answering
always
to their question. I'm not making new points.
That's
okay?
fine. Go ahead.
Dr. Woodbury, you mentioned a Suyuti, volume 2, page 1, and you mentioned Abdullah ibn Umar.
Part 2.
I'm sorry, part 2, page 1. I said volume, that's okay. Abdullah ibn Umar.
Well, sometimes the volume and the parts are different in Arabic, as you know.
Granted, I have no problem. Abdullah ibn Umar, you said that he said, let not any one of you claim that he has the entirety of the Quran. Did you go to the Suyuti himself, or do you have the text under which this statement was made?
Not on this particular one, but he does refer to it. He gives his sources in here.
Fine, but I'm asking, did he mention the circumstances under which Abdullah ibn Umar made such a statement? Under the caliphship of Umar, Abu Bakr, Uthman, or whom? At what time, if you have the reference? If you don't find, I will help you with it.
It is on page, I can give you the reference here, and I don't
Sure.
remember the exact historical
Why don't you put it in its
part here, but it's on page 117. It's on page 117 at the bottom, and Abdullah ibn Umar reportedly said, "Let none of you say, I have got the whole of the Quran. How does he know what all of it is? Much of the Quran has gone. Let him say instead, I have got what has survived." Suyuti, part 2, page 1.
Let me clarify one point. This statement was made by Abdullah ibn Umar after the Battle of Yamama. He got with some of the Sahaba, and he was discussing the issue of, and this was before the compilation of Uthman, okay? He said, let not any of you think that he's got the entirety of the Quran, because we cannot verify it. He thought that many of the memorizers of the Quran have been killed, because he didn't know what happened in the battle at that time. Because Uthman, the caliph at that time, he did not let many of the memorizers actually go to the battle anyway, because of this particular purpose. So Abdullah ibn Umar was expressing his fear. Do you think that you memorize all the Quran? Don't you know that many of the memorizers have been killed? He didn't know what happened exactly. But actually, he was corrected, and Al-Suyuti has been also revised on this and has been corrected by other authors and jurists who said Al-Suyuti was not quoting the entirety of what happened at this incident. I wanted to correct this one point. The other point I would like to bring...
Can we move to them before you get to the other point?
Just neither Jeffrey nor Burton, who are not trying to disprove Islam. I mean, these are not missionaries here.
No.
These are just secular scholars.
Yes.
Jeffrey was at Columbia University. Burton's book is published through Cambridge University. I've forgotten where he is, right? St. Andrews, I believe, is where he is.
Right.
But these are not people who are trying to find anything wrong.
I'm not subjecting the issue.
They're unbiased interpreters, and they come to a quite different conclusion from looking at those same texts, which is that numbers of people were killed in the Battle of El Yamama who did know parts of the Quran, and this led to the great concern at that time to bring together copies which were quite different, as is evidence. Now, I'm not saying that the Quran is not a faithful rendering of basically what was said and done at the time. I'm not saying it's not a faithful rendering, but you are claiming more for the text than unbiased scholars who look at it conclude looking at the very same sources. That's all I'm saying.
But there is one thing that I was pointing out, and this is the importance of the remark I made, that scholars can reach sources, but they can never say, we exhausted all sources. This is the point. Research is always research. But the assertion of the Quran and the challenge of the Quran to anyone is a challenge that still stands until today. The challenge of purity, the challenge of the unalteration, the challenge of physical, scientific, and other kinds of miracles, the challenge of eloquence, all the challenges of the Quran stand still not faced by one single scholar, whether Christian, missionary, or non-missionary. So what I'm saying is, yes, he can be a scholar, but he can miss the point. And that's what he did.
I think this point is exhausted, so
I would
we'll
like
have
to answer one point.
to move to another point.
Can I move to another point?
They would
their turn.
This side would have to go.
Okay, go ahead, and I will respond, sir.
Just some questions that have come to me as I've been speaking in different churches. One is the idea that there is nothing of Muhammad in the Quran. Is this a Muslim position?
Nothing
of Muhammad.
Like his life, his birth, his...
I mean,
Something
Muhammad was just a conduit, a tape recorder. There is absolutely nothing of Muhammad in the Quran. And wasn't it Fazl Rahman who suggested that perhaps there was, and he was thrown out of Pakistan or so? Many Christians have real problems with this.
Yes.
And I would like to hear how you explain that.
I'm not sure they understand. I think they are thinking that it does not include the personality or literary talents of him, is what he means.
Please, let Dr. Jeffrey answer.
But I have a second question, and that is with Mahmoud Taha from the Sudan. I'm sure that all of you know him. Would you? I mean, how do you relate to what he was trying to do? Is this legitimate exegesis, interpretation? Was he violating the text? How do you feel about that?
Yes.
What did he? Why don't you tell us a little bit? What did he do?
Mahmoud Taha to fill in the brother. Okay.
Give him a chance. Would you please wait for him to tell us? Don't answer.
I'm not answering.
Okay. What did Mahmoud Taha do?
I don't know. As far as I could read and understand, that somehow the Meccan surahs contain the essence, the lub of the Quran, and that in Medina there is the first, as it were, application of that essence, and that actually now there can be other applications of that. Of those Meccan surahs in different places, in different contexts. It doesn't have to follow the pattern, as it were, of Medina. Medina was one example. It can be used. It can be a guide, but
other circumstances.
Yes. But actually elsewhere it can be applied perhaps in different ways. I think what he was trying to do is to open up the possibility for new applications, new understandings, new interpretation of what he called the essence of the Quran, which was the Meccan surahs.
So if I understand it correctly, he is a Muslim scholar that's trying to do more research on the Quran, just like hundreds, maybe thousands of other Muslim scholars who have done hundreds of research on the Quran, expressing his own understanding and expressing his own opinion. Is this essentially what you are saying?
No, I don't think that's
okay,
true.
What are you saying then?
I don't know. Apparently whatever he tried to do in the Sudan, they thought it almost heretical, and he was killed. And
I think the point is clear. You see, the point is,
I mean, I just want to
research is not allowed. This is the point.
We get questions on this, and I want to.
So what you are trying to say, that he was persecuted because of his views, right?
Exactly.
No, it's
to some extent.
What is it then?
We have a brother from Sudan.
The Islamic authorities had the man put to death because he was a modernizing influence. Something like that.
As far as I'm concerned, Muhammad Taha is a big nut because he's 7 houses away from where I live exactly. He's a retired engineer, and he thought, I think he studied too much calculus as far as I'm concerned, because he started turning the religion as just 1 plus 2. For example, الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر. الصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر. He said, if you don't do munkar, there is no salah for you.
No prayer.
There is no prayer for you. And then you say you don't have to say ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah, because everybody have self-control within him. So I do not even consider him a scholar in Islam. Even the Muslim, they don't even consider him but a piece of dirt. That's all.
Well, anyway, I don't think we have to be that critical. I think we should not over-dwell on this, and a policy taken by a government, you may or may not agree with it. But I think if what you said in terms of the application, I think that would fall within the broad boundaries of ijtihad in Sharia. Of course, these things would be totally outside of Islam. But if it's just a matter of application, there is no problem, because the early companions of the Prophet themselves were very dynamic and very adjusting in their interpretation. An example of this is the choice of the first 4 caliphs. Each one of them was chosen in a different way, yet all of them applied the principle in the Quran of shura, or mutual consultation. So there's no problem with that. As far as your earlier question, which I think is more pertinent, and I like that you raised it, as to whether the Quran includes anything about the Prophet. Well, to start with, we must realize that the Quran is not like, for example, the Gospels, where the center there is to speak about a particular person. The Quran is the Word of God. It does interact with the humans, commenting on events, giving directions. Sometimes they ask you, "Oh Muhammad, say this." So there is the divine human interaction dynamically found in the Quran. Yet I think it would be an exaggeration also to say that there is nothing about Muhammad the person in the Quran. For you find, for example, mention in the Quran about his character. وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلِقٍ عَظِيمٍ. You have great character. And this is not in human criteria, that's the Word of God. When the Quran described him as uswatun hasana, as a good example or role model for mankind, that he was sent as a mercy to all mankind. There is also the scholars of Sirah, that is the biography of the Prophet. Actually, they refer to the Quran as #1 authentic source, even though it's not entirely about Sirah, but in terms of authenticity, it's #1 source, because there is mention there on some of the battles in which the Prophet was included. There is mention there of some of the arguments and discussion that went between him and Christian deputations with Jewish communities. So in one sense, we could say that there is quite a bit in the Quran about the Prophet and the directives that he was receiving from God. But yes, it is not a biography. The Quran is not a biography about the Prophet.
My question was not about Muhammad. That Muhammad himself was engaged in the writing, the composition of the Quran.
No, absolutely none. There is absolutely no evidence of that. In fact, the Quran, as an internal evidence, mention it, and all external evidence seems to refer to it, that he was unlettered, and the Quran also called him ummi, unlettered, and more importantly, وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ you know Arabic. وما كنت تتلو من قبله من كتاب ولا تخطه بيمينك إذا لارتاب المبطلون. That you, Muhammad, never were able beforehand, before the revelation came to you, able to write any book, recite any book, even religious book, or write with your hand, because if that were the case, some of those who want to create troubles would have raised any suspicion about you. There is no question about that. Some mention is made at times in hadith literature that, for example, in later Madani period, later in like the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, that they said that the pagans were arguing and the Prophet said, no, remove that word or something like that. But even that narration say, وَلَيْسَ يُحْسِنُ الْكِتَابَ. Even towards the end of his life, even if he learned a few things, he was not involved in writing the Quran at all. And the greatest evidence, actually, he remained as ummi.
But if Muslims suggest that or write that, is this considered a grave heresy or
grave? To say that Muhammad wrote?
That there was some part of Muhammad in the
قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. As the Quran say, bring forth your evidence if you are truthful. So if anyone claims that, let them bring their evidence.
Yeah, okay.
And there is no evidence. The evidence is totally the contrary.
I read Fazlur Rahman's book, and he's a distinguished scholar at the University of Chicago. The statement for which he got thrown out of Pakistan was his statement that the Quran was revealed through the mind of Muhammad. And just to make that clear, so we could discuss, he felt that, he didn't clarify what he meant, but that was the statement, that it was revealed through the mind of Muhammad. In other words,
why is that so dangerous?
I really don't know. But the other point I just wanted to make, just to clarify one other issue, Burton, whom you refer to, he's also, I think, a very brilliant scholar, but his position he finally arrived at was rather radical. He believed that much more than Muslims believe. He believed that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually made sure that the compilation and the arrangement of the Quran, that was his thesis, was actually done in his lifetime and not with the death, after his death by Zayd and etc. So he was debating against that traditional belief. So, but in he's been criticized for that, but the point of it is if anything, he felt that the Quran perhaps had more integrity than Muslims, perhaps in some strange way, were willing to admit. And finally, just in terms of authority, arguments from authority are weak, of course. I know that, but since we're using them, many Western scholars have maintained that the Quran is an authentic representation of what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said under what he believed to be inspiration. I think that's the way they usually put it. Gibb and Watt and Esposito and Denny and Gold-Zahir and Kenneth Craig, who's a great Christian-Muslim dialogue expert, and William Muir, who's quite an overzealous, well, in any case, and Richard Burton. Not all Western scholars have agreed with that. A person, for example, Crone, who wrote the book Hajarism, comes up with a very different point of view. But yeah, many Western scholars have felt that it's a document of tremendous integrity. And like I said, I think these arguments from authority don't really go very far. But, I'm just saying that some have. As you said, Dr. Woodbury, I don't know if they're going as far as to say that they made sure they collected everything. I think they might agree with you in that he may have missed a detail here or two, or verses or something like that. But they do believe that what Muslims have in their possession is the authentic utterances of, they at least are authentic utterances of his under divine inspiration.
Yeah. Let me...
Go ahead, but what I'm suggesting is we want to move to the audience, so please go ahead.
I had a question asked to me that I could not answer.
I'm just reminding you that we have to move to this.
I was asked what specific verses or surahs were missing in Ibn Masud, excuse me. He omits surahs 1, 113, 114, that's 18 verses. He omits Surah 94, verse 6, and then he adds verses, and I could give you the places, but I won't. I have them here before me if you want to know what they are. As to all of the texts being given up to be burned, Ibn Masud refused to have his codex destroyed by Uthman, as it had already become the standard text of Kufa. Ubay ibn Ka'b, it was destroyed by Uthman, but copies are said to have existed in the 3rd Islamic century, that is the 900s. And a codex of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari differed substantially from both of those and from the text of Ibn Masud. And I've got the list of verses here, but there are 143 verses that it differs from. So we're talking about manuscripts with substantial differences, and not all of them given up readily, and certainly a record of many of them in books like Jeffrey. Again, I would agree that what we have in the Quran, I believe, is essentially what came through Muhammad. I'm not basically arguing that, but I'm arguing that if you say you've got it all exactly the way it came from God, and then historically have squelched many of the opportunities to study it, even then still so many of these evidences creep up that it wasn't as neat as what's theory that you're presenting. I'm sorry, that's not a good choice of words, but I'll use it. I did not mean it in a derogatory way.
Okay, this is the last point to be discussed on the panel. So.
Yes, there seem to be...
to respond to that, because that was not my question.
Yeah, there seem to be...
Not quite my question. I said
that's fine.
Give us contradiction.
There seem to be quite a bit of emphasis about the burning of Osman, and I like to present a comparable situation here. For more than 1,000 years, we had only the Catholics around, and when the Protestant movement 1500 years ago, there was considerable amount of persecution by the Catholics, and burning and persecution. Yet the movement in the Protestant, and you are living here now to be witness to it, the Catholic Church had not been able to burn or remove or eliminate the Protestant movement. Even the Protestants today have their King James Version that contains 66 books, which is different from the Catholic 73 books of Bible. My point is that burning or persecution or abuse or violence does not destroy movements and does not destroy beliefs. If it is true that the movement or the burning of Osman had changed versions, like you say, that would have survived, especially if the history of the Quran is to memorize it by heart. These other versions that you are talking about would have been memorized, it would have been published today, and we would have had somebody, just like the Protestants today, among them and the Catholics. This is not a Muslim, he is not publishing anything, he is not memorizing the Quran, this is a Christian writer, he is entitled to his views. This is number one. Number two, I resent the insinuation that in Islam, if someone is expressing an opinion, then they are persecuted for their beliefs or their writing, and two names had been brought up here. I can bring for you hundreds, gentlemen, I can bring for you hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe millions of Christians that were burned by the church for their beliefs, or for Galileo, who spoke of a scientific fact, was burned for heresy by the Christian church. This is number one. I can bring for you the history of the Crusaders. I can bring for you the history of the Catholic Church. I can bring for you the history of Spain. I can bring for you the fact that the Muslims, who constitute 30% of the country of Ethiopia, they are never allowed a government job under Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia and who was an official member of the
text.
We are talking about right now, and the point was brought by Reverend Voglar about Mahmoud Taha. This is not the text in Mahmoud Taha. This is number one. Number two, even the fundamentalists in this country, they burn abortion clinics and influence. Why don't you ask him? What did Mahmoud Taha have to do with the text?
May I interfere, please? I'm
answering a point brought by your side. Why don't you tell us what it has to do with the text?
Let me address the question. I think the question raised.
We should move to the second point. We have to move to the question and answer. Okay. So I'd like you to respond
just
to
very quick. Yeah,
the
I respond directly. I'm not going to
please.
deal with the burning of the book or Mahmoud Taha or anyone else. I think I must say that Dr. Woodbury misunderstood my question. My question was very specific and very clear. He said he claims that there have been variations, and that the variations are right there in the book. And I said that in spite of the unauthenticity of this, I said they are so trivial, and I asked him to give us one single example where there is any variation that would have any consequences in belief. I know some variations if you don't know them. For example, in one case it says, لَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَبْتَغُوا فَضْلًا مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ. There is no blame for you to seek provision from your Lord. In one of those qira'at, it adds, في مواسم الحج, in occasions of Hajj, which scholars of the Quran like Dr. Draz clearly indicated that this probably was a glossarist. It was not the official copy, it was a glossarist observation, but they probably didn't have the use of the bracket. When you refer to the collection of Ibn Mas'ud, what does it mean dropped? You can say that a manuscript that was available to him might have been losing parts of it. And don't forget that you're talking about the first chapter, which is Al-Fatiha, and 113 and 114, the last page, which is a few verses at the end of the Quran. It's quite possible that any collection would be missing those particular portions. However, what is more important, the point I'm emphasizing, you could give me a pile of books, but unauthentic.
No,
this was mentioned
verses in the middle, though, that I didn't list.
No, let me give you the answer to this. The riwayah, or the narration about Ibn Mas'ud, was mentioned by Ibn Hajar, and the scholars of verification of narrations said, لَمْ يَصِحَّ عَنْهُ. It is not correctly attributed to him. It is wrongly attributed to him. And two great scholars like An-Nawawi, scholars of hadith, specialists, and Ibn Hazm, the famous Andalusi scholar, they criticized it and they proved that to be a fabricated or false type of narration. Secondly, they gave another very interesting evidence that the recitation of the Quran today, which is the riwayat or the way of recitation of Hafs and Asim, actually were taken and based on Ibn Mas'ud. And ask any reciter of the Quran, get any recording of the Quran anywhere in the Muslim world, in the riwayah of Asim, it has the entire Quran. Number 3, there is total illogicality about that assumption on the part of the writers. Total illogicality. Nobody ever denies that Muslims pray 5 times a day, and that the compulsory requirement in each prayer, nobody denied that. Ibn Mas'ud prayed like that. Memorize Al-Fatiha. Is it possible that Ibn Mas'ud assumed that he doesn't have to write that because everybody memorizes it, it's only a few lines? There is no question at all that Al-Fatiha is part and parcel of the Quran. But the final comment I'd like to add, which many scholars of the Quran, if you've read for them, also said even those weak, flimsy riwayat can never stand in the face of tawatur. And let me explain to those who don't understand the word tawatur. Tawatur means that you get information consistently, the same, through groups of people who picked it or learned it from other groups, large group, in a way that would make it impossible for them to cooperate and collaborate or conspire to lie. You get any copy of the Quran anywhere in the Muslim world, published at any time, and compare it with the 2 documents that goes back to the time of Osman, the 3rd Caliph, one in Tashkent, one in Topkapi Museum, Istanbul, Turkey. It has exactly identical things, which is consistent again with the generation after generation of the memorizer of the Quran. When you have all that complete, overwhelming tawatur through various sources, the same thing, and you get some flimsy reports here and there, and that could be presented as an argument, I think, from the standpoint of scholars.
Thank you, Dr. Jamal.
It's questionable.
Please, no more comments, please. Dr. Woodbury will have the final comment.
It's just these are not, we're not just talking about surahs at the beginning and the end. We're talking about added verses next to 37, verse 169, next to 52.
Source again. Source.
These are the commentaries that these are basically the Quranic commentaries that
commentaries is not necessarily source. Commentary means somebody making his own exegesis or explanation. They are human beings. They are not infallible. I am asking for authentic, recognized, authentic sources. Throughout all this argument, you have failed to give me a single one, and the one you gave was misunderstood, and I explained that already.
Well, it seems somewhat illogical that a page and a half of sources would all be wrong. And the added...
It's not sources. You can write 1,000 books containing the same wrong information derived from the same original source, which was wrong. Ibn Hajar. You can write
Okay, I think the point is clear. I guess the point is clear. No, please.
I'm not going to come up with a different conclusion.
Shakir, please, let me manage it so that we're running out of time. Please,
one statement.
make it in the question and answer. Keep it for the question and answer. Please, I'd like to give you the final comment on that.
Okay. Well, I have little more to add here, but what it seems to be is let's just put it this way. When non-Muslim scholars who are not trying to disprove Islam study the same evidence, they do not come up with the official Muslim view. I think that's all we are saying. And
Thank you.
I will leave it at that.
Please, Dr. Jamal. Please, let's move to the question and answer.
Dr.
Ali. Please bear with me. I have a lot of things I have been writing down here. I like to summarize them as possible. Regarding the sources, the most latest comment over here. Just last week, I was in a discussion seminar in the night. We were discussing about the meaning of jihad. And one fellow who was a student of Nasruddin Albani, he brought in 5 books. And he read the translation of one particular point about meaning of jihad. After he finished, he said, I have given you 5 sources. I said, Ya akhi, you have given me only 1 source, not 5. Because they are all copying from each other. And he immediately accepted he is right. I have given you only one source. That's regard to the source. Now, about the memorizers of the Quran, I met one Hafiz in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, who had learned Quran from his father, and his father learned by verbally, his father, and that chain goes back all the way to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's the same Quran. Now, about the Haman or Haman, you said that Quran says it was in Egypt and it was from Persia, something to that effect. Now, Dr. Maurice Bucaille, who wrote that book, there's an old version. There's a new edition of his book has come out, and he has not given anybody right to publish except he publishes from France and Sagar's publication, and you need the Sagar publication variation. He was my guest in January 1987, and he visited the United States many places, and he came to Chicago. In Chicago, he was my guest, and he gave many lectures, many places. And I have all his lectures and personal conversations on the videotape. And in one of at the University of Illinois, he gave a talk, and in that talk, he presented from the Greek hieroglyphs the exact shape of the word, and he said, taken from the tablets, and the Haman is mentioned on one of the tablets in Egypt, and he says people jumping on it, but it is there. Finally, Quran proved to be right, and all people who were criticizing were wrong. See, this is the typical about the Quran. See, at one time, yeah, I'll finish it. At one time, at the time of the Kepler's theory of the sun and the moon, and people said that now we found out the sun is stationary and all the other planets going all around. Whereas Quran said that the sun and the moon are moving in their orbits. And so the people of the scholar of the time that jump on the Quran, the Muslims, that look, the Quran is wrong, and now we know this is for sure. Now in this century we find out that even the sun is moving within the galaxy. So we find out that science has to catch up with the Quran. Quran doesn't need to catch up with anything else.
Your final comment, please?
Yeah, this is my final. And he talked about the Prophet Muhammad, we were talking about it, that what Quran has to say about it. And we learned that the Prophet Muhammad was not just like a postman who delivered the Quran and walked away. He interpreted, he lived the life of the Quran, and the Quran is a witness, and Hadith is a witness for it.
Thank you. That was a statement. Okay. Muhammad Taha.
Just getting back again on Muhammad Taha. He was existing during the Numeri regime, as you know. And he's not only being defined by the high Sudan councils that he is mushrik, it's only been by Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And they give him the chance to repent, and he insisted even when they take him to fulfill the judgment on him, he still didn't want to repent back. And not only that, his policy went to get all the youth. Those are the people, they didn't have a lot of knowledge, or the people that are just striving to get some knowledge, and that's what his audience was. Yeah. And it was so disturbing to the country that's put their attention, and even his texture so disturbing to the point that not only the Muslim, anybody have any kind of godly view, he will not agree with what he is coming up with. So
Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions, one for the Muslim side and the other for the Christian side. For the Christian side, what are the contradictions within the Quran that you see? And for the Muslim side, what are the scientific facts in the Quran or within the Quran?
I gave you this list of aggregations. I'm not sure if you would want to use the word contradictions, but I do have a list of 20 abrogated and abrogating verses, which at least suggest a change. I'm not sure you'd put it under the, you might, okay. Well, some might interpret those as
he considers the abrogation as
others would
contradiction.
interpret them in the light of progressive revelation. But that's what I have.
Okay, could you give an example, please?
The Qibla is one, the fast of Ramadan.
What is the fast of Ramadan? What is it?
You mean what actual passages?
I mean, what is concerning the fast?
It's the changing of the fast from a few days to the month of Ramadan. Slaying of enemies in the sacred mosque, imprisonment of the adulteress, and on and on. I don't.
I guess we have
there are 20 here. Okay. I don't know how much is accomplished by just reading off all 20.
Enough example. Okay, let's move.
I must say, first of all, that there is absolutely no contradiction whatsoever. I think we discussed the question of abrogation before. For example, on the question of Qibla, what happened is that the Kaaba actually was intended by God to be the place to which people direct their faces because it is the most ancient built by Abraham, the father of monotheism. Yet, at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Kaaba was desecrated by the pagan Arabs who placed their idols inside that. So the Muslims directed their faces toward the prayer towards another temple, that is toward Jerusalem. And that was also to test the faith of those people who became Muslims after paganism, to make sure that their hearts are not attached to the idols in the Kaaba. And then when the time came when this detachment of the idol and idol worship in the Kaaba was already established in their hearts and their minds, then the Quran came. And by the way, if you read the Quran, you find explanation to that. The order came to the Muslim that now they can direct their faces toward the Qibla. I don't see that whatsoever as the contradiction. The question of siyam or fasting, I think you're probably referring to the fact that on one hand, the Quran says, Shahru Ramadan, that you fast the months of Ramadan, but on the other hand it says, Ayyaman ma'dudat, a few days. There is no contradiction, because a month, a counted days, actually it doesn't say a few days, a counted days, ma'dudat, specified number of days. A specified number of days and a month is not really a contradiction, because those specified number of days comes to 1 month. And you could go on and on with this. I couldn't really see it.
Was generally understood to be the fast leading into Yom Kippur, though, that the Jews...
it has absolutely nothing to do with the Yom Kippur. It is the nine months in the lunar Islamic calendar, and it goes for a whole month. It's not connected in any way, shape, or form with the Yom Kippur.
No. Well, it isn't anymore.
You're confusing that, Dr. Woodbury. I think you're confusing that with the fasting of Ashura, which is a voluntary fasting.
Yes.
When the Prophet went, I think, don't mix
many scholars would differ with that.
Scholars who don't know make that mix. Well, the Quran is quite clear. The compulsory fasting on Muslim is the month of Ramadan. It is a specified number of days, and those specified number are 1 month. But the other instance, which is totally unconnected with that, is when the Prophet went to Medina, he found that the Jews are fasting. So he asked, why are those people fasting? So he was told that they are fasting when Allah saved them from the Egyptians. So the Prophet said, نَحْنُ أَوْلَى بِمُوسَى مِنْهُمْ. We are closer to Moses than they. And he asked Muslims to fast that. But this was a voluntary fasting, the 10th of Ashura. So there is absolutely no connection between...
Okay, I think we got an answer. Okay, he raised another question. Yes, the second, what was the second part?
Okay. Well, the scientific fact...
I think we dealt with that enough, so please give a quick example, please.
Okay, I was just going to introduce this book and touch on this little thing that I got here. The scientific facts you can read without too much trouble in this book, but I would like to use that 1 minute of answer to again express my surprise at that there was certain amount of insinuations that Muslims are persecuted because of their religion and things like that, or expressing views, and it came from my dear friend Harold Voglar, who lived in Egypt for 18 years. He was a missionary in Egypt and among the Muslims, and from what I understand he was very much welcome. I had a lot of friends highly honored and highly respected, so obviously he lived through it. No one had killed him. I want to bring also to his attention that it is not the Muslims that are spreading these kind of publications in the name of Islam. This one here is coming from the fundamentalists by the name of the Prophet, which is a severe insult to the Muslim, and you write to them, they have a post office box, they never answer you. Muslims do not do that to Christians. This is unsolicited mail from someone who calls himself Sheikh Abdullah. And then in the same time, he starts his pamphlets by saying Allahu Akbar, and he writes it in an Islamic terminology and trying to deceive people, apparently to give them the impression that he is a Muslim. So it is not the Muslims really that persecute people, and it is not the Muslim that spread this kind of information. These are Christian sources in this country, and it is not the Muslims really that are abusing the freedom of speech, and the Muslims are good citizens.
But even Muslims who do wrong, they are wronged.
Yeah.
If Muslim even does that, is wrong.
Right.
Period.
My point certainly was not persecution. I mean, there's enough of that going around everywhere. But the idea of perhaps a new hermeneutic, new ways of nuancing the Quran. And what I heard you say is that if anyone suggests that somehow Muhammad participated in the creation of the Quran, that at this point anyway, this is just totally, well, I would say unacceptable.
I simply said that the consistent evidence is that the Prophet did not write the Quran. There is even scientific evidence, not only just historical, that the Quran was not flowing from his own knowledge or his own background, or else how could he speak about these things? What we're simply saying is that if someone, I'm not closing the door, I say if someone makes a claim that indeed the Quran is a product of the mind of the Prophet or his own ideas, by the way, in fairness to late Fazlur Rahman, I looked at that section in his book, and I don't think he came outright and said that the Prophet Muhammad wrote the Quran. He puts it in a very complex philosophical way. But anyway, so it still admits the divine origin of the Quran. But what I'm saying, if anyone makes any claim that the Quran was a product of the mind of the Prophet or his own work, I simply quoted the Quran. Let them bring their evidence if they are truthful. I'm not closing the door, but I'm simply saying I haven't seen that evidence. If there's any, let it be brought.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for being so nice and so patient. What I'd like you to do, finally, is for each of you over here to make a statement in 1 minute, and we'll conclude by that.
Okay.
Please. Who wants to start first? And no new topics, please.
No new taxes.
Because we can stay here till tomorrow.
I will
one
start.
from each of us, or just one from
Everybody.
I will
from,
start.
Okay.
I will start.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Muslims, my 1 minute statement will be, Muslims are like everyone else, scholars. They can do as much research as they can like to do. They can make as many claims as they like to. Muslims, non-Muslims, about the Quran, they are more than welcome. The Quran invites everyone to examine it and be critical of it and analyze it. Yet, all what we ask of them to do is do it on a scholarly level, present proof, present documentation, instead of just making false accusation. We will not only say that about the Quran, but we will say it about the Bible. We will say it about any other sacred book of any religion. So the Muslims are not excluded from research or excluded from doing studies on their books or on other books. As a matter of fact, they are more than welcome. And I think if you examine the Islamic history, you will find out the Islamic people are the most tolerant, not only within their own religion, but with other religions. Jews flourished under the Muslims,
Dr. Hussain.
Christians flourished under the Muslims, and they live in complete tolerance.
Thank you.
Let the one from the other side
Please.
go.
Anyone who feels who is ready, please do it.
I would say that for many of us, there is this struggle of how to read the Quran, a Christian reading of the Quran. Obviously, it's going to be different from a Muslim reading. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't be Christian, and we would be Muslims. So does this mean that as we try to read the Quran from our own point of view, from our own experience, that somehow what we say and what we do is wrong? Is it unacceptable? Can there be a Christian reading of the Quran, a legitimate, honest Christian reading of the Quran? And I would hope that perhaps that there could be. But obviously it's going to be different. It must by nature be different from the Muslim reading. But how can we work this out, and how can we come to some kind of understanding that it's all right for Christians to try to have their own reading of the Quran?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Vagla. Yes, please go ahead, Dr.
I think that as a convert to Islam, I think that my own, and I think the Christian panel tried to bring this out, that sometimes we could be a little bit overprotective, over-defensive about things, and sometimes that could stifle innovative thinking. I think that to some extent, maybe we are sometimes a little bit too defensive. And what else did I want to say? The only other point I wanted to address was the comment just made by Dr. Vogler. So, personally, I've read a lot of Kenneth Craig, and I find that when he writes about the Quran, I usually discover something extremely enlightening. And even though I don't agree with everything he says, I find that his experience of the Quran has proven to be very illuminating for me, and I've gained from it. So I think, in answer to your question, I think that there could be, a Christian reading of the Quran. Muslims may not agree with it, but I think we should invite that in dialogues like this, that opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffrey.
Two of them over there.
Yeah, can we have one of you, Shakir or Dr. Jamal?
Fine. See, we've just concluded the second day of discussions. We've gone through discussing our different conceptions of God, the prophets and the books. Almost we have finished, except for one discussion that's left. I think it's due to say that the tests that the Quran established for itself and other scriptures is still yet to be met. The test of authenticity, the test of non-contradictory text and context of the scripture is yet to be met by other scriptures, as the Quran met its own test. Also, the searching and the assertion of the conclusions of those searchings about the Quran and Islam from the so-called non-Muslim researchers yet to prove, I'm not talking about intentions here, but to prove scholarship in terms of researching to the depth of the point until
Thank you,
come
Imam
to the main source.
Thank you.
Okay.
Please, one of you, please.
One thing that concerns me a little bit is my Muslim friends use many of these same authors as authorities in some cases, but only where they agree with them, it seems. These sources for these variant
topics,
readings,
please, Dr.
which it is not,
please.
it's related to this. The actual Arabic words are added here that are missing or added to the present text. And the sources of these are men like al-Badawi, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Nasafi, Suyuti, Tabari. These are all people that would be used as authorities if they said what people wanted to hear. But when they give some of these evidences of change in the text, then they're no longer authorities. This concerns me. But having said that, let me say that I have worked through the Quran many, many times with great personal profit, and I do hope that my Muslim friends are also reading through the Bible, not to see what they can disagree with, but what can we learn from it.
Thank you, Dr. Woodward. Dr. Jamal Badawi.
This evening we have touched on a number of aspects about the Quran in terms of its authority, authenticity, its contents, and its impact in the past and at present. What was mentioned was not rhetorical, was not testimonial, was solid, direct, straightforward facts. Secondly, we have heard also some of what I like to call shubuhat, some of the doubts that were raised by our brethren, and it became quite distinctly clear that once you go beyond the surface and you give more weight to hadith literature than opinion of people, even they are authorities are not always right in everything. When you defer to more authentic sources, you will find the futility of trying to raise any doubt really about the integrity of the Quran, whether authority or authenticity, and I believe that has been ample tonight. But I agree also that the greatest challenge, both for Muslims and non-Muslims, is to forget about what we panelists here said, to get hold of a copy of the Quran. I don't mind, you get a copy of the Bible as well. Get hold of a copy of the Quran. Read it on your own. You have difficulty, ask some Muslim who is knowledgeable. And I think the greatest challenge here is to try to find out whether the Quran is concocted by someone, written by someone, or is it as many who accepted Islam concluded that for the first time they discovered that this is unlike any other book, that God is speaking to them.
Thank you, Dr. Jamal Badr. Reverend Justin.
I am interested in some claims of the Quran. One is, of course, that it is the perfect and final book. But I find as I read it, I think really it should be much better. If it is the final source and final authority, I frankly am disappointed. Secondly, the claim of being in continuity with Judaism, with the Old Testament, I find that the Quran fundamentally denies the basic religious thrust, which is the teaching of worshiping God through the sacrificial system. I don't find the continuity there. In the New Testament, of course, the fundamental thing is that Jesus is the one who fulfills the Old Testament, and I see him being displaced and made as another prophet when his main role was to come as Savior and mediator. My personal needs are not met because I do not find in the Quran that which will give me certainty and hope and clarity of salvation. I find a legal system which has already been bypassed by Paul, and I also find I am disappointed with the doctrine of God, in that God, I find a dualism. You have an eternal book and you have something that is
I'd like to thank you very much.
And I don't find why I need it.
I hope you understand the Quran better to correct these views.
Well, I'd like to thank you all. Really, we enjoyed your discussion and appreciate all the time you gave for us, and we hope
rather than Scripture. Furthermore, I would say anybody coming from the outside and looking at the story of Abraham in Surah 21, verses 52 through 70, being saved from a fiery furnace, would see that it is from the Jewish scribe Jonathan ben Uzziel, who mistook Ur for Or, and thought of Ur of the Chaldees that Abraham came from for Ur, or a fire. Then a second reason I have some problems is because of the report that the texts are that the texts are exactly the way we have them from the time of Muhammad, and this seems to ignore historical records, Muslim historical records. First of all, in Suyuti, in Itqan, Volume 1, page 21, he indicates that there is no collected, arranged, and collated body of revelations at the death of Muhammad. Then when we read Ibn Abi Dawood in the Kitab Masahif, page 83, it indicates that many of the companions of the Prophet of God had their own reading of the Quran, but they died and their readings disappeared soon afterwards. Then again, as we read Ibn Abi Dawood in Kitab al-Masahif, page 23, portions were lost when some reciters died at the Battle of al-Yamama, and the text was only collated after Muhammad's death by a number of companions. Again, they would seem to be essentially consistent, but a large number of variant readings. No two texts are identical at that time. And this is not just reciting different dialects without the vowel points there. And so you have 19 years after the death of Muhammad, the third caliph, that is Uthman, attempting a standardized text. Now, he took the Codex of Zayd, which was closed and was kept in relative seclusion with Hafsa, but it was not well known at that time. But you had the codices of Abdullah ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b with considerable variance. Furthermore, after Uthman's death, al-Hallaj, the governor of Kufa, made 11 amendments and corrections. I have had...
Who was the last person you mentioned?
Al-Hallaj, governor of Kufa, made 11 amendments and corrections. Now, one of my students once just compared, and here is a volume by Arthur Jeffrey, Materials for a History of the Text of the Quran. This is a book just on the variants now, I mean in Arabic. We're not, somebody said yesterday, produce another Quran. Well, this is at least producing the variants. And it is interesting that one of my students on his own compared 3 ancient manuscripts and came up with he compared a number of Christian manuscripts of the New Testament and some of the Muslim manuscripts. He compared the Sinaiticus Codex, an ancient one of the New Testament and a large part of the Old Testament, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus, and the Ephraimi rescript. He compared them in the New Testament for the number of verses omitted, the number added, and the number of texts affected. He compared the Codex Ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b with the text the way we have it today, and he found out that as for the number of verses in the New Testament as compared to the number of verses in the Quran, that the textual problem was even a slightly greater one for the Quran than it was for the New Testament, and I have the details of that here. Now, this is amazing, particularly when Uthman burned the manuscripts that tried to get them all burned, the ones that differed. So it is amazing to me that although Muslims have tried to get rid of the variants, there are still records of variants that are even slightly greater in the verses affected than you have for the New Testament manuscripts. And I could give a number of illustrations of how this has been suppressed. For example, in 1947, a student at the Egyptian University of Cairo wrote a thesis on textual criticism. And he never was given his degree. He was threatened with disciplinary action, and his advisor was dismissed from the university.
What is his name? What is his
I
name?
do not have his name, but he is recorded. You can find the record of it in Arthur Jeffrey, who was
after 1.5 hours.
Oh my goodness.
You didn't eat good?
I just want to shake your
Yeah.
hand.
Can bring you a sandwich. You like the sandwich?
No, I mean, what did we go to eat? I thought.
What do you go to the kitchen and get you a sandwich?
Cookie or something. Come on, give us a cup of coffee.
Sure.
How about a cup of coffee?
Now, folks, and on this one we'll be discussing part 2, which is the Quran the Word of God? And we'll have a presentation by Dr. Jamal Badawi first, and then by Dr. Woodbury, and then we'll start the discussion after that. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Can you please close the door so that we get no noise from outside?
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Just as it happened with many other topics, of course, 10 minutes is not an awful lot of time for a major topic like this. So, of course, it's not possible to respond to many of the points that were raised about the Quran before, and I hope this will be coming through the discussion. So my purpose in this capsulized discussion starter, you might say, is to directly address the question, is the Quran the Word of God, and if so, how or why? In doing this, I think there are two related issues which I mentioned before, that I apply them with a great deal of impartiality. I hope I'm not applying double standards here. I can apply the same critical question to the Bible as well as to the Quran. So I'm applying them now to the Quran. And I'd say I'll begin with two and then I conclude with one additional point, that at least there are two fundamental issues, which would be also comparative issues. The question of authority and authenticity. By authority means, is there evidence that this, sufficient, convincing evidence that this is the Word of God? It's not the word of some other humans or followers of the Prophet. To answer that question, we can examine both internal evidence and external evidence. As far as the internal evidence is concerned, we find that the Quran, and again I'm not going to bore you with so many citations, I have the figures if you like. There are several verses in the Quran that affirms that the Quran has come from Allah. Secondly, there are many verses in the Quran that specifically and explicitly deny that it is from any source other than Allah. Thirdly, the style of the Quran, if you look at it generally speaking, you notice that actually it is not somebody's writing and says Muhammad went, Muhammad did that. It's nothing like that. It is actually God directly speaking to mankind, like verses, we created the heavens and earth and we created you and so on. So the style itself, in many cases even it addresses the Prophet himself and say, O Muhammad, which means that somebody else is telling the Prophet what to say. Which remind me with Deuteronomy, God will put the word in his mouth. He's not speaking on his own. As far as the external evidence, some people would say, look, internal evidence may not be enough because somebody could concoct a book or a document and just make it look as if it's coming from God. So we have to look at the external evidence as well. When we look at the external evidence, there are a number of points that strikes us as Muslims. One, is that that claim is not only in the Quran, but it was also made by the one through whom the Quran was revealed, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And as indicated earlier, his reputation, even among his enemies, it was that of a man of a great deal of integrity and truthfulness. Even in the night when he was supposed to be assassinated by the pagans, he let Ali to sleep in his bed to return the deposits to the people who wanted to kill him. They used to belie him as a prophet, yet they keep their deposits with him. So that shows that there was some other prejudice that's preventing them from following him, yet on a personal level they fully trusted him. Secondly, as indicated earlier, and I'd be willing to discuss any objection to this, there's absolutely no credible evidence to show that, yes, he was truthful but epileptic or have some psychological phenomena or psychic element or hallucination. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. 3, that the Quran surprisingly contains some chastisement of the Prophet for a small mistake of interpretation, as was mentioned earlier. Nobody writes a book chastising himself for a small mistake that nobody even noted, because nobody noted even that the Prophet was getting frowned a little bit because of the interruption of that blind man. That shows the truthfulness of communicating exactly what was revealed to him. 6thly, the Prophet, peace be upon him, as one of my colleagues also mentioned earlier, has gone through periods of great pain. False accusation made against his wife, people challenging him with questions, yet if he were to concoct something, he did not just appear as someone who knows all and answer. He would wait until the revelation comes, sometimes at great deal of mocking on the part of his enemies. 7th, that the Quran and the saying of the Prophet through whom the Quran was revealed, both contain numerous prophecies, many of which have already come to pass during the lifetime of the Prophet or shortly after. Not a single one whatsoever was proven to be false, and some of which could have been very, very in contemporary history. We find the same people in prison, and I happen to know more closely about that because I have been in touch with the Islamic Teaching Center. There are hundreds and thousands of people actually who are in prison on very serious crimes and problems. They have been totally changed when they read the Quran. There have been people like Yusuf Islam, or formerly Cat Stevens, who report, Cat Stevens is only one of them, who reported that just by reading the Quran, they said it's different from any book we read before, religious or non-religious. I feel that God is speaking to me. So that testimony also, even though it cannot be taken alone because personal experience could be quite subjective, but in line with all of the other evidence that has been given, if we consider the millions and millions of people throughout history, in all countries, in all cultures, whose life have been totally transformed by the Quran, to me as a Muslim, that is much more than sufficient reason to say, yes, it is the Word of God.
Thank you, Dr. Imam. Dr. Woodbury?
Once again, I have to say that I speak with considerable hesitation because it is not my pattern to say things about Muhammad or the Quran negatively, but and I see a great deal that I feel very positive about too, but this is an assigned topic, and so I think I need to explain why I do not accept the Quran as the Word of God, even though I do see the Word in Christ and as it is testified in Scripture. Let me just say that I studied Arabic in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, under a Muslim professor who would give us the rules of grammar and then would on occasion say, the Quran is different here. I also studied under Daoud Rahbar, who was a Muslim when I studied under him. But he had given a paper where he encouraged Muslims to be like Christians in really looking at the textual evidence for the Quran and analyzing it to construct as faithful a text as possible. And he was told to recant, and his paper was not included in the proceedings of the conference, and that was one of the things that ultimately led him to become a Christian, was because he felt he could not really study the Quran as a Muslim and really look for and analyze the textual sources and so forth. But let me say, first of all, on internal evidence, why I have questions about the Quran. First of all, Baladuri, page 473, mentions, again, a Muslim author mentions about a secretary's exclamation that gets added to Surah 23, an exclamation by Uthman's foster brother, Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh. Furthermore,
what exclamation, can you just indicate what it is, just to get clear information on it?
Okay,
What is it?
I'll have to check my source here a little later, and I'll be happy to do that. Then I find what appear to me as a reader of the Bible to be confusions in the Quran, and it is always up to the second scripture. The burden of proof always rides with the second scripture to prove that it has not made a mistake, it seems to me. But Haman, for example, is put in the court of Pharaoh rather than in the court of Ahasuerus in Surah 40, verse 36 or 38, depending on your translation. Pharaoh said, Haman built for men a tower. Then certainly the obvious evidence, it would seem, for Surah 19, verse 28 or 29, is that when Mary, or Miriam in Arabic, is referred to as a sister of Aaron, that this would seem to be in a confusion, certainly on the surface there, rather than the mother of Jesus. It seems to be a confusion of two entirely different periods. And then talking about scientific evidence, in Surah 12, verse 49, the fertility of Egypt is described as resulting from rain rather than the inundation of the Nile.
Where is that?
Surah 12:49, if I've written it down correctly. And then there are certain passages in the Quran which it seems to me that an unbiased reader would see are taken from Jewish folklore rather than being in the scriptures that the Quran says it affirms. For example, the story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5, verses 27 through 32. Verse 31, then God sent a raven scratching up the ground to show him how to hide his brother's naked corpse. Well, this is found in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, chapter 21, not in the scriptures of the Bible. Then in Surah 5, verse 32, for that cause we decreed for the children of Israel that whoever killeth a human being for other than manslaughter or corruption in the earth, it shall be as if he killed all mankind, and whosoever saveth the life of one, it shall be as if he saved the life of all mankind. And again, this seems to be taken largely from the Mishnah of the Sanhedrin 4:5. There.
Is Arthur Jeffrey a Christian reference or a Muslim reference?
It is a Christian reference, but it is, you've got the,
thank you.
You've got the record right here,
okay,
so that I wouldn't make too much of a point of it. I think I have used my time here just to show that basically in the internal evidence and the textual evidence, I am not saying that the Quran is inaccurate. I'm just saying that their textual problems are as great as the Christian textual problems. And certainly the inconsistencies to me within the text are harder for me to accept than what you point out in the Bible.
Okay. Well, first of all, several remarks has been made about Rahbar who did not get his paper published, or the student, even if that's the story, suppose even the story is true, who could not get his degree. This has nothing to do really with the great effort of textual criticism that has already been done by the predecessor, and you did refer yourself to Jalaluddin al-Suyuti and others. In fact, that Jeffrey's book is based itself on a book written by Muslim, Abu Dawud al-Sijistani, the book of Kuttab al-Masahif. And that's why Dr. Draz criticized this contradiction sometimes is found in some non-Muslim writers about the Quran, when they said on one hand they say that the textual criticism of the Quran is in its infancy, yet in the very same books they write, you look at only the bibliography of the hundreds and hundreds of Muslim references about the sciences of the Quran and preservation, which seem to indicate a great deal of not a very straight scholarship in that sense. That's one thing. The other thing, when you talk about the internal evidence, I cannot respond to that because you haven't given me what exclamation or what exactly you're referring to in Surah 23. So until you get that, I'll reserve the answer to that. Thirdly, you said that it caused confusion to the Christian writer because it confuses Haman with Pharaoh or this. I think this is the same argument that one sister commented on before, that this is a very unfair thing to relate to the Quran because it has the presumption that the record in the Bible is absolutely accurate, 100%. So anything in the Quran that is different from the Bible is not to be taken as accurate. Not the other way around, which is a distinct, in fact, to the Muslim, it is a real thing, that the error is the other way around. Secondly, you refer to one instance when you say there is confusion between the sister of Aaron. This is one a very interesting question that you raised because since you said you know Arabic, you know that the expression in the Arabic language and in the Quran itself, when it says brother of or sister of, does not mean the blood brother. Just like the Bible, when it calls the Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, the daughter of Aaron, not the immediate daughter, but it means in the family. And Mary, mentioned in the Quran, of course, as coming from a priestly family. You are a sister of Aaron, not Aaron of Moses, the brother of Moses, sister of Aaron, like you see in Akh al-Arab, or brother of Arabs, not necessarily referring to one particular the children of Israel, not necessarily the immediate children. So this is really not a problem at all. Then there was a question that you say that in Surah 12, Ayah 49, it says that the source of fertility was the rain, not the Nile. The verses are here, it has nothing to do with that, what you're talking about. It speaks about Prophet Joseph alayhi salam. It has nothing to do with what you said. It says Joseph, when there was fear of shortage of food, or when the king saw that dream, he said, you will plant for 7 years, and whatever you don't eat, keep it. And then there will be 7 years where it's very difficult, and then there will be a year where there will be a great deal of shortage of food. It has nothing to do with fertility. But even if it were, which is not. Never mentioned the Nile or anything. But even if it were, what's the problem of fertility being both based on the rain as well as the Nile? But in any case, that is not the case. The quotation doesn't say what you're talking about. And then you have a number of points that you raised that you somehow insinuated that the Quran must be based on previous scriptures or on for example, the apocryphal writings or Jewish. Yeah, I have two responses to that. One, I have no problem whatsoever if there is anything in the Quran that has parallel in the Bible, because the one who revealed the Bible in its original form is God. The one who revealed the Quran is God. And the Quran, but I must say with due respect, Dr. Woodbury, that you have a habit of quoting half verses of the Quran. In the previous session, you were saying the Quran says it came to confirm the scriptures before it, but you forgot to read the other part, وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ, a criterion, a guardian over it, which means you don't accept everything except that which is meet the criterion of the Quran. So I have no problem with this so-called parallel so long as it's consistent with the Quran, because the revelation comes from the same source, not because one copies from the other. As far as the other apocryphal, some people even say the gospel of infancy and this and that. My answer to that is very simple. It has been admitted earlier, and it is quite clear that the choice of books to be included as canonized versus apocryphal was a decision made by human beings sitting down. And imagine human beings sitting in a council to decide what is God's revelation and what is not. This is not a matter for voting. So we don't know whether these things classified as apocryphal were not in its original form, really, at least containing part of the truth, whether it relates to Abraham or other points that you raised. Now coming to the question of preservation. You referred to Jalaluddin al-Suyuti's Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran. And I think, again, there is the confusion that I see in many Western writings about the Quran. In some cases, it may be innocent. In some cases, it is deliberate. When they make a big mix between recording or writing the Quran in full on one hand, and between compiling the Quran, i.e. bringing all the manuscripts under one roof. All the authentic sources, including the most authentic hadith in Bukhari, likely, given the circumstances and context in which they were made. Number 8, the Quran itself makes a challenge. One of my brothers mentioned that earlier, that if the Quran was from any source other than Allah, they would have found therein many contradictions. I mean, I haven't seen any credible, they have been alleged contradictions. I have never seen any credible thing that you could say this is a contradiction of fact, something that could not be explained reasonably without going into great lengths explaining it out. Number 9, that the Quran challenged his contemporaries, and the Arabs were excellent in their expression that the Prophet was never a poet or a speech maker. That when they claimed that this Quran comes from human source, it was challenging them in a very provocative way to produce something like the Quran. They failed. Then said 10 chapters like the Quran, they failed. Then 1 chapter, even then they failed. So even the smallest part of the Quran, anyone who tried to imitate the Quran made himself a laughing stock of his people. And that was the witness and testimony of people who excelled historically. That's the epic of eloquency. That must say something about the nature of the Quran, and that has never been met, to my knowledge, for the 1400 years since its revelation. But that's not all, because you could have beautiful thing that is not necessarily true or not revelation. But one of the most amazing thing that one of the sisters raised in her questions, which could not be brushed aside, even though it is not the main mission of the Quran, is that unlike any previous scriptures, quite frankly, there is no single verse in the Quran that you could say it comes into conflict with an established scientific fact. I refer you to a book by Maurice Bucaille, The Bible, the Quran, and Science, where he made a study for both scriptures. But more amazingly even is the testimony given by Christian scientists. I'm not saying about a church group. The scientists of Christian faith, specialists in their area, like Dr. Keith Moore, an internationally known authority on anatomy and embryology, when the Quran speaks in amazing accuracy about the early embryonic stages that were discovered only after the discovery of the electronic microscope, something that was definitely, he was challenged once in a lecture. Could this have been known before? He said, no, there's no way. From the history of science we know, there's no way. And the same thing applies to geology, astronomy, and many other areas that are so amazing, many of which are mentioned in Bucaille's book, that definitely the Prophet could have not known it, because not only religious people, but even scientists could not understand this, that the Quran describes in great accuracy. In addition to this, we find that the question of authenticity also was alluded to earlier about the Osman copies. I'd be glad to address that. I mean, there's not enough time in the remaining few minutes to address it. But I could only put it in a nutshell by saying that, uniquely speaking, the Quran was preserved simultaneously via 2 means at the same time. Memorization, which is even the more important, as well as writing in full. There have been no Qur'ans, no versions of the Quran. Versions, there have been qira'at, and I'll address that. Some people mix qira'at with versions. There's nothing like versions as such of the Quran. And there is even documentary evidence until today that shows that the Quran really that we have today is the same as was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, if you take the combined evidence by preservation in memorization and writing all together. But to conclude, it is not the issue simply of saying that there is evidence of authority of the Quran, it is from Allah, which in itself is sufficient. It is not simply to say that it is not only from Allah but has been preserved intact without adulteration, nor to say that it challenged people from the scientific standpoint or the literal standpoint, which even means a lot because it points out to something about its source. But I think what is more important also for the average Muslim is the fact that the Quran provided what is best for the guidance of humanity in our understanding. On the issue of belief in God, it restored the true monotheistic faith of all of the prophets prior to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It discussed in no unclear terms the aberration that has taken place in history, correcting them. It corrected the vision of the prophets and restored them to the proper status without deifying them on one hand or downgrading them and accusing them of terrible sins on the other. It provided a better, in our humble understanding, explanation of the question of salvation. Removed the notion of original sin and blood sacrifice and given hope to millions of people to reach for God and seek His help in overcoming sin. It provided a vivid description and explanation of the life hereafter, punishment and reward, individual responsibility, and the hope in the mercy and compassion of God. It gave a proper structure for worship that stand in the middle between the extreme of formalism and ritualism practiced by Jews at the time of Jesus, and between simply talking about love without really giving some structure and organization in the life of the individual, making a daily diet, spiritual diet, devotional prayer 5 times every day. It takes a few minutes, but it's tremendous. It has tremendous impact in the life of people. It provided comprehensive guidance, practical guidance in the lives of people, not only in the case of love and peace, but how to behave in war, how to behave in peace with friends, with enemies, with people living in peace who are not Muslims. And that is more practical if it were to be a total guidance for all mankind at all times. Finally, the fruits of that has been amazing. Just like my Christian brethren has been talking about the impact on the disciples encountering Jesus, the same claim has been made throughout history. People who have been most evil, responding to the Quran, they were totally changed. Umar, a person who was going to kill the Prophet, on his way to kill the Prophet, hearing the Quran, his whole heart has been transformed and became one of the most pious people in history.